The Honorable, the Vice President.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to contribute on an act to provide for the registration of non-profit organizations, the establishment and maintenance of a register of non-profit organizations, and the obligations of non-profit organizations, and for related matters. Mr. Vice President, today is a very important debate, and as usual, the government has come before us to tell us that it is a simple debate and it is a work in progress, and if we start something now, we can finish it later. And those are lines we've been accustomed to hearing over time. The Attorney General started his presentation today by using one of his favorite terms, analysis paralysis. And Senator Ramdeen noted it, but there was a point in his justification for the lack of consultation that really bothered me today. And the Attorney General said that this has been ongoing for 2.5 years, and that the reason they weren't able to consult with the vast majority of the NGOs is because you need this kind of legislation so people could be registered and you could know where to find them. And I found that to be particularly disingenuous from the list of names of NGOs that presented themselves and said that they weren't consulted. I mean, to suggest that you could not find Fishermen and Friends of the Sea and CAISO, I mean, really and truly, the Attorney General was just really trying to give us a 6-for-9 today. However, when the opposition was first furnished with this bill, we held our caucus and we looked at the legislation. And it was from that we wrote to the NGOs and said, listen, this bill is coming into Parliament, and there seems to be a rush to get this through. And we have noted time and time again that you've not been consulted. And from that, the NGOs were able to coalesce and send a number of correspondence to almost all senators, because the bill went through the House and then came here. And the onus is on us as a Senate to look carefully at what the NGOs, as the key stakeholder in this bill, has had to say. You know, early on in the presentation of the Minister of Labour, Minister of Labour made a very important statement where she said that today she was hoping to get suggestions and amendments, and she was hoping to hear from us what we thought could be changed and what should be better. And we in the UNC have said time and time again that we support good legislation and good law that will benefit all the people of Trinidad and Tobago. But the sentiments expressed by the Minister of Labour is opposed to the sentiments expressed by the Attorney General on this very same topic of amendments. Because we've had bills here where amendments were just not accepted in the interest of expedience. Now, the Attorney General moved his own amendments on the floor, so I assume that they would be looking to accept amendments today, partially because they have their own amendments. However, how can we, as an opposition, knowing that the government has ignored the voices of hundreds of people, thousands of people who've been reaching out to them, saying, please listen to us, we have ideas, this is our industry, this is our field, listen to what we have to say. All of those voices have been ignored. How can we lend our voice to that? How can we support any legislation that the government brings here today when they have been ignoring the sector that they are seeking to regulate? Mr. Vice President, I feel that it would be almost a breach of our parliamentary duty for us as parliamentarians to say that we are willing to pass legislation that ignores the input of the sector that it will most impact. And, speaking of fishermen and friends of the sea, When we were preparing for the debate, a number of NGOs reached out to us, like I said. The opposition held a press conference on Sunday telling the NGOs, look, this is coming to the Senate. Look out for it, because it is a simple majority. Let your voices be heard, because that is the true hallmark of any democracy, the citizens' participation in the legislative process. And in the things that I was sent was a press release issued by the NGO Fishermen and Friends of the Sea. And it was entitled, Persecuting Civil Society Organizations, Using a Hammer to Kill an Ant. And I want to start my presentation there because it goes into a lot of the things that I have to say later on. Because they've started off by saying, and this is not the UNC, the Minister of Trade and Cross-Talk keeps talking about hysteria and that the opposition is encouraging hysteria. Now, this is before we started to debate this bill, right? Are we becoming a dictatorial police state? The proposed non-profit organization bill 2019 may be passed on Friday 29th, so this has now gone, right? And FFOS fears that the proposed law is a new tool which, if abused, can be used to persecute independent civil society entities who stand in defense of the public right in the face of procedural irregularity, illegality, corruption, and open thievery. This is not the opposition. These are the NGOs. Goes on to say that they recognize there is merit in monitoring non-governmental organizations. Now, everybody that we have spoken to so far has no issue with oversight, with regulation, with accountability. What they are saying is, if you are going to do this, speak with us first. Simple request. And I really have to ask the Attorney General at this point in time, when you can stand up here and laud what people do and say, look, we acknowledge your contribution to society, why are you constantly ducking them? This is not the first bill the Attorney General has just not sought to consult the NGOs on. This is the second bill in this session in 2019 that we are seeing the NGOs have to write after the fact and say, Mr. Attorney General, hold your hand, listen to what we have to say. Begging. But the opposition, again, will bring the letters to Parliament, will read into the record their concerns, and we will do our best to lend voices, as Senator Ramdeen said, to the voiceless. The NGOs have, as I said, written expressing grave concerns about the arbitrary exercise of power. And that reminded me, Mr. Vice President, of the writings of John Adams, one of the constitutional framers of the United States of America, and the second president of the United States, who told us and warned us that we must nip the shoots of arbitrary power in its bud to maintain the maxim that would preserve the liberties of any people. And this is what we're trying to do. Because for all the sky is falling and we must ensure that this bill is passed today so that you could send your children to school and whatever language the government is using to convince us, the government, to create the hysteria that we must pass this legislation today and there's no other way. What the opposition is interested in and will always be interested in is preserving the rights of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Senator Ramdeen had started going through the document why the non-profit organizations or NPOs are alarmed by the Attorney General's bill. And in the interest of time, he could not go through all of their concerns. And I proposed to put two more on the table because some of them jumped out at me. All of them were extremely valid, echoed the sentiments of the Law Association. So it just appears that this entire bill was drafted without any consideration for the recommendations that people gave. So as it stands, as it appears, the government, even if they consult you, really have no intention of taking your recommendations on board. So they will do as they please, and we just have to take it. But in this document, the NGOs noted that the government has done willful damage to a critical sector by poisoning public perception of NPOs and the country. In whipping up fear to help pass the bill, the Tourism Minister, Randall Mitchell, took to the Parliament floor to describe NPOs as unchecked, unsupervised, and that they could go about their activities without any monitoring, and that it was very attractive to criminals who wished to launder money, illicit proceeds, and further terrorist activities.
That's like what the Ministry of Tourism.
And imagine now, Mr. Vice President, this is not the first time we have seen the government implement this type of tactic. You remember Petrotrin? Do you remember that everybody in Petrotrin was a millionaire, and that if they close down Petrotrin, you will get good roads and good schools and whatnot, and Petrotrin was the villain? Today in this bill, the NPOs are the villain. All our crime problems, the money laundering, the terrorism, they're housed in NPOs, and if we get this right, we'll be sorted. We'll be doing the right thing. This is a similar tactic, but this time, and Mr. Vice President, last year, at the end of last year, we warned that any government that is willing to implement this kind of public relations strategy against citizens will do it to anybody. Last year it was Petrotrin, we warned WASA. This year it's the NPOs. But they are speaking out, and more people will continue to speak out because the government just can't help themselves. This is their approach to any type of legislation. They also spoke in another one of the publications by the NGOs and NPOs who have sent out numerous publications over the last week, spoke about the parts of the legislation can be used to victimize parts of the NGO community, can be used to victimize parts of the NGO community if any executive feels that they are too politically inclined, or if you are involved in politics. And that also jumped out at me, because as I go through the clauses, and I'll start shortly, that there are a number of arbitrary sections where the powers are quite simply too wide, that the exercise of power to decommission or to cancel the registration, of the NGO and how they meet their obligations, they are so wide, Mr. Vice President, that it is open to victimization. And the reason that jumped out to me is because as we were prosecuting the matter on Sandals and the government's proposal to build the Sandals Hotel, the drivers of that conversation were the NGOs. The drivers of that conversation in terms of the location of the hotel, what it would do to the environment of Tobago, they were the NGOs. And the government at that time took a stance to brand people as being unpatriotic, as being anti-development in Tobago. And there were very toxic statements coming from government personnel directed at members, senior members of that NGO in Tobago. And so you can understand, Mr. Vice President, why they would be alarmed. Because if your registration could be cancelled for not completing the form correctly, as prescribed by this legislation, or if you can be denied according to Clause 6, subsection 2, you can be, if the proposed name of the organization, in the opinion of the Registrar General, is for any reason, objectionable, you can be denied, or they can refuse to register or renew your application. Mr. Vice President, these people who hold nothing but the interest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago in their particular sectors, they are now afraid that if they are seen as too much of a check on government power, or if their voices are too loud or too influential, that they may be subject to victimization under this piece of legislation. Yes, the noisemakers, all the people, Mr. Vice President, that the government has time and time again sought to brand as unpatriotic or against development. Those people are writing to them now and saying, listen, we're not comfortable with this. And with good reason. With good reason, Mr. Vice President. Again, nobody is saying we don't want effective legislation or that they don't want legislation to regulate the nonprofit organizations. What they're saying is, take a step back, talk to us, let us assess what the problem is, let us assess what the needs are, and then draft the legislation in accordance with that. And that takes me, Mr. Vice President, to the Law Association. Law Association, in its commentary to the Attorney General, agreed almost totally with the MPOs that the proposed bill is effectively introducing a policing system to nonprofit organizations, which the Law Association considers to be harsh and repressive, and which will ultimately have a negative impact on the sector. So now these are two different bodies saying, hold your hand, Mr. Attorney General. This is not the right way to go about this. Imagine, Mr. Vice President, a number of persons have already spoken, and I will not go into it, about a risk-based, focused, and proportionate approach. All of these things, in this purported 2.5 years of consultation, could have been done. It could have reasonably been done, that this risk-based assessment, a focused approach, all of these things could have been done. So that all that leaves us to understand is that there's simply no political will in getting these things done. All of this is essentially a mama guy. And nobody will be comforted by the Attorney General saying, pass the bill today, and we won't operationalize it until we have consultation and until we have an education campaign. You told us this was on the books for 2.5 years. If we are to believe that, then all those things had to be done prior to bringing the legislation. Don't try to convince us to lend our support to flawed legislation and tell us you'll fix it after, you'll fix the gaps after. That is unacceptable, and I think is a great indictment on the current Attorney General. You know, the Law Association also spoke about that the legislation appears to be administratively unworkable. As important. That's why I'm saying it's probably a big mama guy here. A lot of senators raised whether or not the FIU is prepared, whether the Registrar General, etc. But the Law Association noted in the paper presented to the Attorney General that if the objective of the bill is to bring under the microscope of the Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs every single non-profit organization, whether incorporated or unincorporated, it is quite simply, as they said, administratively unworkable. So we are left to ask again, why bring the legislation now, where you know you can't effectively implement it? According to your own statements, you have no intention of implementing it right now, but you're still refusing to talk to the people. You're still refusing to take a logical, proportionate approach to bringing the legislation to Parliament and holding the proper consultations, having the proper conversations. I think it is a gross disrespect to come to Parliament and say, I'll talk to you after. We will pass it, and I will talk to you after. But that, as I said, is the modus operandi of this government. Speaking of the administrative unworkability, but before I get back to that, I spoke initially, Mr. Vice President, of the arbitrariness of the legislation and the wide ambit. And so I was going through it, and under Part 3, obligations of the nonprofit organization, Clause 14 speaks to the controller of a nonprofit organization shall ensure that proper financial accounts and records of the following are kept. And so it speaks to cash. But Part B speaks to all gifts, sales, and purchase of property. You go to the definition section, and you look at the definition of property. Bearing in mind, it says that they have to, under the obligations, that they have to report all, shall ensure that proper financial accounts of all gifts and sales of property, right? And for the interest of the public, record, I would read what property means under this legislation. It means assets of any kind, whether tangible or intangible, movable or immovable, however acquired, and legal documents or instruments in any form, including electronic or digital, evidencing title to or interest in such assets, including but not limited to cash, bank credits, payment cards, payment instruments, traveler's checks, bank checks, money orders, shares, securities, letters of credit, whether situated in Trinidad and Tobago or elsewhere, and includes a legal or equitable interest, whether full or partial, or any such property, precious metals, oil or other natural resources and their refined products, modular refineries and related material, and other economic resources which may be used to obtain funds or goods or services. And they're telling us, Mr. Vice President, that these obligations under this legislation are in no way onerous for the vast majority of the non-profits. Had I not read that out here, one, that all gifts and sales of property. Mr. Vice President, are we really expecting your cricket clubs, etc., to keep obligations like this? Are we honestly saying this is the best way to achieve the aims of the legislation? Because I find that very hard to believe. But gifts are mentioned again under Part 4 of offenses, where in this section, contributions mean the receipts of cash, donations, gifts, grants, and subventions. You see, and gifts aren't defined, right? Property was defined, but gifts are not defined in this legislation. And this is where I'm saying that the NGOs, they are not being hysterical, and they aren't making a mountain out of a molehill. They are very justified to be very wary of any government that is seeking to pass legislation where they can be shut down, they can be jailed, and I know the Attorney General said he's moving an amendment, but unless I see that on paper, and it's happening now, I don't believe it, right? So you can say what you want, right? Why not include it before? Why not circulate your amendment before if you knew you were going to do it? Don't tell us, look, calm down, it's okay, they wouldn't go to jail. Don't believe it. So as it stands right now, with the legislation we have before us, Mr. Vice President, you are prescribing punishment that includes jail time for people who may not even understand fully what their obligations are under this legislation. And I find that, Mr. Vice President, to be, again, very irresponsible of the government. And then speaking now under the obligations of the NPOs, they speak about any other matters that may be prescribed by the regulations. And then we go down to the regulations, right? And it tells us in Part 5, so that's Clause 26, subsection 1, the minister with whom responsibility for finance is assigned may make regulations, and it may make regulations to the regulator in order to carry out the effective provisions of this act. And then it goes on to say that the regulations made under this section shall be subject to the negative resolution of Parliament. Now, with the process that has already been implemented with this bill, with the marked lack of consultation, with the total disregard for all stakeholders, basically blatantly ignoring the reasonable request to stay your hand in this legislation until you've spoken with the stakeholders, you really want us to accept that you would make proper regulations, that your regulations you would have consulted with these stakeholders, and then we allow that to be by the negative resolution of Parliament. Mr. Vice President, this is my respectful view. If the government could have done this without coming to Parliament, they probably would have. They don't believe in oversight, and they do not believe in accountability. The same oversight and accountability that they're asking the NGOs to adhere to, the same oversight and accountability that Senator Alison West, Minister in the Ministry of Finance, spoke of, that we should look at the system of accountability. It's the same accountability that the government seeks to avoid at every chance that they get. As I said before, this idea that regulations can be attached to this legislation and the parliamentary oversight is by negative resolution is something we can't stand for because of the manner in which the government has conducted itself for the totality of this. I look at the Law Association speaking again on how you intend to regulate small groups of enthusiasts in remote communities. I have said it before, I am from a small community where we have a number of activities. There are almost 3 community groups in my area. They're divided into little sections, but they hold things like Christmas treats, etc. And they solicit funds from the community to hold a Christmas treat every year for the members of the community. They aren't watching Parliament Channel and understanding that they're going to be swept up by this legislation, right? It is the interest of their representatives, again, to make people aware. But again, everybody has said it before, the ambit is simply too wide. The NGOs, the Law Association, they've all proposed a tiered system. They've all proposed the risk assessment. All of this ought to have been done before the legislation came to Parliament. None of it was done. So, you know, the government, the Attorney General, speaks always of an all-of-government approach to all sorts of things, right? And my question is, why, in the preparation of this legislation, the ministries that deal most with small communities and community groups did not tell the Attorney General what you are trying to do here is unworkable and it is unnecessarily punitive? You see, I don't think they speak to each other, Mr. Vice President. I think that the Attorney General looks around and sees, all right, this may make me, you know, look good today, I'll bring this. And we'll get to talk about follow the money, and we'll get to say all these buzzwords. And I don't think, right, I don't think that the Attorney General anticipated the pushback from the NGOs, or else he may have thought twice before bringing this, but it's a little too late to change course now, so he has to hold his ground, I assume. Yeah. Mr. Vice President, right? Mr. Vice President, the main concern of almost everyone that I have spoken to on this piece of legislation is the haste with which it's going through our parliamentary system and the lack of consultation. And it's, like I said before, it's not the first time the Attorney General has been accused. So I went through to look at who else has accused the Attorney General of not consulting. And I saw the Law Association on the courts legislation, the Media Association on the cybercrime bill. I reminded you all of the sexual offenses. What do they have against speaking to people? If your interest or your intent is on bringing the best piece of legislation to this Parliament, then I would think you would want the widest scope of consultation, the most voices. But this is why I'm telling you that this government likes the mama guy people. Because on the marijuana legislation, right, wide consultation. The consultations are being pappy-showed all over the place. Yeah. You know why? Because it's a good talking point. You're getting on board with internationals. They have no interest in doing that really, you know. That is really to kind of get a feel to see how it will work in the election. So we will throw it out and we will, and basically see who they could get rounds up some interest to vote for them. Mr. Vice President, so what I'm saying is you are capable You are capable of holding, you are capable of holding wide consultations. You are capable of, and under this piece of legislation, some of these same NGOs that they consulting with might have to shut down based on who is disqualified as a controller under their very legislation. So they may want to watch, they may be speaking to them on one hand and really trying to mash up the entire NGO on the other hand. But, Mr. Vice President, what I'm saying is you are capable of doing it. You have shown that you can do it. I remember there was a prison sector reform consultation that was similarly wide. Why not do it for something like this? Was this not viewed as important? Were the players, did they deem them not influential enough? Why not speak to the people before bringing the legislation? But, Mr. Vice President, as I started, I really wanted to raise the topic and put on the record some more of the consultation aspects. The fact that this law is essentially arbitrary. The fact that there are sections in here that are too wide, don't really make any sense to put this in the legislation because it does not achieve the aims. And I would like to reiterate what Senator Mark said, what Senator Ramdeen said, that there's no way the opposition can reasonably support anything they put before us here today, because we are representatives of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And until the government can speak to them, we cannot support this bill. If you feel like you can rush through legislation without speaking with stakeholders, well, you'll have to do it on your own, and you'll have to stand on your own accord. And I thank you.
Senator Ameen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I rise to contribute to this bill, which is being called the NPO bill, because it deals with the not-for-profit organizations within the country and regulating them, bringing them into a framework of regulation. Mr. Vice President, I think I'm about the 9th or 10th speaker in this debate. We started at 10 a.m., it's now 6:22 p.m. We have a number of persons from the NGO fraternity who visited the public gallery. They have now gone, but I'm sure some of them are still listening to Parliament Channel. They may be viewing the debate. And it is with keen interest that they do so. I think it is very clear from the contributions on the government bench, the opposition, and independent, that I have not heard any person object to having accountability, to having agencies, NGOs, organizations who access money, particularly government funding, for there to be some sort of accountability. I don't think that is what the opposition is saying, and I don't think we heard that anywhere else. The main bone of contention has to do with just a few items. One has to do with the rush. One has to do with the lack of consultation. One has to do with the knowledge and capacity of the NGOs. And
Caution you one time, as much as you've just started your contribution, you are creating that context. Let me just guide all members who want to join the debate at this point. So we're hearing the same points, if you notice, at this late stage of the debate coming up. Consultation, overreaching, all of those points have been heard. So as you make your contribution, Senator Ameen, just be guided that tedious repetition will now apply in relation to the points that have gone before. Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I was listing those things to say that those points have been made, and I do not intend to repeat them. But thank you very much for your intervention. One issue that has not really been discussed much has to do with the capacity of the Board of Inland Revenue, the FIU, the Ministry of Legal Affairs, the Registrar General, and the role they would play in this legislation, in the enacting, in the operationalization of this. Mr. Vice President, I am hoping, because the Attorney General often speaks about when he brings legislation in terms of operationalizing. We have seen a number of pieces of legislation come to Parliament, and I know it is the duty of the Attorney General to bring legislation, and perhaps to list those pieces of legislation passed as achievements. It is an achievement of the Parliament when we sit together. It is a part of democracy. And even at present, we see a competition in the media as to who made the more important amendments in another place. You know, and the truth is that the purpose of Parliament is it is the seat of democracy. And in fact, when we have consultation and collaboration between the opposition and government, it is a victory for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, and the opposition will continue to represent the voice of the people who are not in government. So, I don't think it is a matter of, you know, this competition that we seem to think that we need to have. At the end of the day, the people of Trinidad and Tobago win when we have good legislation. Mr. Vice President, as I indicated to you, I want to add, I endorse the point that it will be an abuse of our power here to sit and make a decision or make decisions in a hurry to meet a deadline just to get an approval. That point was made, but I don't think it is so difficult to consult with the NGOs. So that is something that I endorse. Knowledge and capacity of the NGOs. The minister in the Ministry of Finance spoke about previous occasions where organizations were engaged, and in terms of financial literacy and in terms of them improving their own capacity to meet the requirements set out in this legislation. There is need for continued efforts like that, Mr. President. And having the ministry do its part is one thing. Having the awareness from those NGOs that will be affected will take time. I think even with the best efforts of the Ministry of Finance, of whatever agency or body they use to reach out, education takes time, awareness takes time, and the ability in order for them to build that capacity, it takes time. If we even have to look at the capacity of the government agencies who are responsible, who are going to be responsible, even now, I don't think that even we are the not-for-profit organizations, but those organizations that businesses, small business entities, I often wonder at the capacity of the government agencies in terms of regulating, in terms of overseeing. And then you are adding this for the not-for-profit organizations. So even now, if this gets the rubber stamp that is being sought here today, we will be doing a disservice to the cause, to the purpose for this thing. I want to ask, is the purpose just to meet the CFATF deadline, just to meet because there's a re-rating at on April of 2019, which is this month. I understand it is between the 8th and the 12th. So the question I want to ask is the purpose of bringing this legislation solely to meet that requirement, or do we really have any real intention of improving the capacity of our NGOs and the transparency and protecting the abuse of funding and so on?
231B, Mr. Vice President.
There's only House of Representatives, we're trying to shut down the debate.
Senator Mark.
Yeah, just warning.
No, but it's not for you to warn him.
Yeah.
The member is allowed to raise a point of order.
It's a trick, just try.
Senator Mark, the member again is allowed to raise a point of order upon which I am allowed to rule. So please allow me to do so. Senator Ameen, I'm listening, and like I said, you're beginning your contribution and you're still within the 10-minute mark. but I can tell the lines that you're going down. It's hard coming in this late into the debate not to end up traversing points that have gone before, but you do find yourself in breach of standing order that was raised by the Attorney General as it speaks a tedious repetition. So what I would ask you to do is if you have any new points that have not gone before, to just go straight to those points. That way you won't be in breach of the standing order. And that goes for other members that wants to join the debate. At this point and at this late stage, it is strictly new points that have not been raised prior. Senator Ameen, continue.
Thank you very much, Madam. Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I did indicate that as a person coming later in the debate, there are certain points I will simply endorse and move on. I don't see what is who getting it anyway. Mr. Vice President.
1 second. There's no need to reiterate what you're stating, and that's fine. If you're endorsing the point, all of that is great. But like I said, the time is running, and the time it takes for you to endorse the point, it can breach that standing order in relation to tedious repetition. So that's why I'm guiding you to just move forward to a new point. Just start with the new points and do that. That way you won't be in breach of the standing order. Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, Mr. Vice President, I really don't want to get controversial, and if I have to respond to the people who are trying to stop us from contributing to this debate, I will get controversial. So I want to end my contribution. I will not be supporting this bill without the consultation and the input and involvement of the stakeholders, the NGOs and the NPOs. The government will not be using me and using the opposition and using the parliament for a rubber stamp just to get maybe get a CFAT farm thing. I will not be, you will not be doing that with my help and my cooperation. Thank you.
Senator Thompson-Ahye.
Mr. Vice President, I thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this bill, which has a very interesting long title, An Act to Provide for the Registration of Non-Profit Organizations, the Establishment and Maintenance of a Register of Non-Profit Organizations, the Obligations of Non-Profit Organizations, and for related matters. Very commendable indeed. And the Attorney General came into Parliament this morning very buoyant, and he introduced the bill by mentioning a word which he said was a Latin word, caritas. And Latin being my favorite and best subject at school, it struck a chord with me. And I thought of another Latin word that went along with caritas, veritas caritatis, which is the motto of my alma mater. And I like the word veritas because it means truth. Now, as I looked at the bill, I could see where other members were regarding it in another light and another saying, no good deed goes unpunished. And really, when one thinks of all of the good, yes, well, somebody's listening. I thank you, Mr. Attorney General. That happens through the work of the NGOs. One realizes that it is a very, very important arm of the society. Indeed, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, when it gave its concluding observations on children's report, on Trinidad and Tobago's report on the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, said that it was a bit disturbed, though these are my words, that so many NGOs were in fact doing the work of the government in implementing the rights of the child. Now, I must say this was based on our last report. And now, since then, the Children's Authority has come on stream, and there's a lot more work being done by the government in terms of children's rights. Now, when we look at certain provisions of the bill, and I speak first of all of Section 5, it says a person shall not operate a non-profit organization in Trinidad and Tobago unless the non-profit organization is registered under this act. Now, we all know that there are existing non-profit organizations. And one would imagine that when the act is passed and this provision comes into effect, what is the position of the existing NGOs or the existing non-profit organizations when the act says that if a person shall not operate a non-profit organization in Trinidad and Tobago because it is not registered? Now, I draw a parallel between that particular provision and one under the Children's Community Residences, Foster Care, and Nurseries Act, Chapter 4604. And in that legislation, Section 3, it says, no person shall manage a community residence without a resident license issued by the authority. So when that act came into force, Mr. Vice President, the act didn't just leave it like that, because it's in similar terms, but the act went on to say that all managers of existing community residents shall, within 3 months, upon the act coming into force, apply to the authority for a residence license. So there was a period where you could apply for the license, and it went on to say that the authority shall, within 6 months of receiving an application under the subsection, issue or refuse a license. So what I'm advocating is that a period be put into the legislation where you can have that, you can get your license, your registration, sorry, in order. Now, I know that the Attorney General will say, most likely, that we are not going to have the act proclaimed and during that period. But a good father knows his child, and may I continue? A good father knows his child, and we know our children in Trinidad and Tobago. We know what happened in terms of the property tax. We know what happened with the vehicle inspection. People are going to wait until the last moment. So I'm suggesting that we put into the legislation a period of time where these things can be done. I'll give way now.
Excellent point. Does Clause 28 assist you? Clause 28 is the transitional provision that says, subject to a non-profit organization other than the company, which we deemed in 8. So companies become automatic, which was in operation before, may continue without registration for a period of 18 months or such longer period. So we specifically provided a transitional provision because we agree with you 100%, Honorable Senator.
All right, thank you. Now, looking at Clause 10, Mr. Vice President, it speaks of cancellation of the registration. So the Registrar General may cancel the registration of a non-profit organization if, and it lists 7 deadly sins. The non-profit organization failed without reasonable cause, is proven to be called non-profit organization, and it goes on and on. Now, so these are reasons for the cancellation. But if, in fact, it is canceled, then you have now, within that period, the non-profit organization to submit written reasons to the satisfaction of the Registrar General as to why the registration should not be canceled. I do not see any legislation, and I'm not comfortable when things are implicit. I would prefer to see an explicit provision which says that the reasons for the cancellation must be spelled out in the notice. I do not want to assume, because we know what happens when you assume, and I would really like the reasons to be put in, just and not only have the organization to give written reasons as to why its registration should not be cancelled. So I'm advocating that this is be written into the law itself, so one doesn't have to speculate or leave it up to the discretion of the body to decide whether they're going to tell you why, or say, well, it is obvious you have not complied with certain things. You should know why it's being cancelled. I would like it specifically be written into the legislation. Well, Mr. Vice President, we have been warned about tedious repetition, and therefore other people have made a point about a tribunal because of the fact of, it's costly to go to a judge to do an appeal. So if something can be put in there, that should be very welcome. And of course, I share my colleagues' concerns about the cancellation, Section 22 and Section 21, about the forfeiture, because many organizations come into being because of charitable souls who really want to do the best for the society. And, they may give their homes or so for the organization to carry out its work, and then they really wouldn't like it to go to some other body that it may not identify with. So those are the points I would like to see in the legislation for the improvement of the law. And I don't think anybody is saying really that we do not want registration. I quite like the points that the Honorable Senator West raised about the benefits of registration, and I could see it happening, because sometimes you really don't know who is doing what. There's a lot of repetition, there's a lot of duplication, where people can really come together, and other people who want to benefit the organization can look at the list perhaps and see how we could work with this organization or how we could benefit this organization, because it's very real. The government cannot do it alone, absolutely not. And there are many people who are very willing to put their talents to the benefit to help other citizens. And we see it all the time. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this society. Children are falling through the cracks every day. Our society seems to be going crazy, and there are many people who have talents and would want to bring it to bear, and they would need the assistance. I wanted to suggest, but then I heard Senator West, Mr. Vice President, talk about the shortage of personnel at the Inland Revenue, because I would really like a situation where you can have in every revenue office in this country, you can have persons who are qualified and working with Inland Revenue who can assist the NGOs, because a number of the people who work in NGOs, they have a lot of heart, they have muscles, but they may not have the qualifications and the know-how to put their books in order. And it is not a question of any wrongdoing, but they just need all the assistance that they can give. So perhaps, even though you are short-staffed in that area, perhaps the government needs to look at ways of perhaps taking away from other areas where there is too much staff. Because there are areas that when you look around, you see there are too many people who have too little to do. And here is an area that is greatly in need of the assistance of people with the know-how, so they can do the best that they can do for our beloved country. I thank you.
Senator Chote.
Mr. Vice President, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I will try to be as mindful as I possibly can be of your earlier caution with respect to tedious repetition. Now, I want to start my contribution this evening by reference to a young woman who came and sat in the public gallery when the debate began. She's an in-service trainee. She's going to become a lawyer, and she's from the village of Ecclesville. And she came to listen, or she wanted to listen to this debate, because as it happens, she and a group of young people within the village, they have a fledgling association where they get together and they help poor families or families who have been hit with illness, job loss, and so on. And they help members in the community through this association. Now, this is a young woman. She is one of the members of the association. Not all of the members of the association are educated, are as educated as she is, but certainly they are all, they have the same vision, and they want to ensure that people in their community receive the kind of help that they need when government agencies can't provide. Now, her little fledgling group is going to fall under this legislation. I don't know what the Honorable Attorney General has proposed with respect to possible amendments when we get to the committee stage, but I will start with one suggestion. Just so that these fledgling organizations or small organizations, you know, the cricket clubs, the All Fours clubs, and that kind of thing, so that they can be protected, may I respectfully suggest that consideration be given to a lower cutoff point. So we will have 3 groups. Let's say a group that doesn't have gross income of more than $30,000 for the annual financial year, they will not be required to register. And then when you have the larger NPOs with income coming in the millions, then of course they have to register and provide audited accounts and this kind of thing. So it will continue to engender a sense of community, a sense of social responsibility amongst young people, and it will protect their organizations as they grow. I think that is important. We don't want to cut them out by making it very difficult for them to register and so on. So that is just a suggestion. Now, I wanted to clear my head and get rid of certain things which I have heard or which have been inferred during the course of the debate this evening in order to try to be as clear as possible in my contribution. I do not accept that failure to pass this legislation will result in us being blacklisted. That is not in the FATF regulations. I went directly to Article Recommendation 8. I looked at it, read it, and I think I understood it. It is quite clear from the FATF website that it is not mandatory for assessing compliance with FATF standards for this legislation to be passed. Now, I don't want anyone to twist what I am saying into a suggestion that I do not think that NPOs should remain unregulated. Now, I pause there. I agree there should be some regulation of NPOs, but we have to understand what we are doing and why before we go forward, because otherwise it would appear as though we are putting the cart before the horse. So the legislation we have in the Senate today, unfortunately, appears to be, it may have taken inspiration from the earlier version of Article 8. And I have to go into that a little bit because there was an earlier version of Article 8, which was pretty broad, and it led to very, very restrictive legislation in certain territories dealing with NPOs. And then there was a group called the Global NPOs, which is now a group that could be found on the actual FATF website. They made representations to the leaders of FATF. And Article 8 is now amended, so we don't have the broad brush approach that we see reflected in the legislation today. Because what the current Article 8 says is you have to do risk assessment before you figure out how to address the risk. So you don't say that all NPOs are likely to be terrorist agencies, because let's focus on it. Article 8 is dealing with money for financing terrorism. So I would respectfully suggest that we have a look again at the current Article 8, see what its objectives are, and see whether we are complying with those objectives. Now, if we look around the world, we have examples of where it's gone wrong. Nigeria, for example. There are many studies done, or there have been many studies done in countries around the world where people rush to legislate after the original Article 8 was promulgated, Nigeria being one. And what they found is that these laws which were passed at that time, they entered into spaces where civil organizations normally operated without fear. If I may just refer to that, it's called, if anybody is interested, it's a wonderful research paper. It's done by a group called Spaces for Change. It's called Closing Spaces for Civil Society and Democratic Engagement in Nigeria. It was published in May of 2017. And one of the things it said is that there are negative repercussions for repercussions of shrinking civic space, and these affect all sections and spheres of society. And it's referred to, actually, these kinds of repressive laws are referred to as bureaucratic harassment. Now, it's a really wonderful research paper, and it shows how broad brush legislation can go wrong. And certainly it is not for me to stand here and try to lecture anybody as to how laws should be drafted and what should be taken into account, but certainly it is something that is useful to read. Now, I also looked at the interpretive note for this recommendation 8. And it is so wonderfully detailed that I really cannot understand how we got it wrong, because it is almost a point-by-point, step-by-step process for risk evaluation and risk monitoring. And it is quite clear, it contains all the measures adopted by the country so far to identify and take effective action dealing with NPOs who are at risk, whether knowingly or unwittingly, of facilitating terrorist financing. Now, we have to remember one thing. It is not as though we have a gap in our laws. Let's not sell our country short, please. Because this Parliament has already enacted the Anti-Terrorism Act. And that act, if you look at it again, has a huge chunk of it dealing with organizations and persons who provide terrorist financing. And it is an extremely detailed piece of legislation with draconian penalties for those individuals and groups who choose to breach those laws. So I don't want anyone to think that Trinidad and Tobago is somehow a lightweight in creating legislation or in legislating for anti-terrorism laws, because we have legislated some very, very stringent laws to deal with issues which may very well arise in the current legislation that we are looking at. So I think we should focus on what we have, look at this legislation, see whether perhaps we could tweak it. Maybe there are things we need to address in this legislation that had not been addressed in the Anti-Terrorism Act. It's quite possible. And tweak it so that we can fill those little gaps if there are any. Now, another thing I want us to remember, because I was quite surprised to hear the suggestion coming from some of the speakers or the contributors today. There was some suggestion that NPOs are somehow unregulated by law. The answer is no. There is a law for associations. Associations are governed by laws. So they are not they are not groups of people going out there and accountable to nobody and, you know, stealing people's money when people give them charity and this kind of thing. I think that kind of assertion really leads to the wrong impression, because they are governed by laws, and their members can ensure that those laws which govern these associations in general are enforced. So it is not as though NPOs are lawless groups, and we now have to get them registered because we don't want them sending money for terrorists. I think that is a very simplistic position for anyone to suggest, and it's also inaccurate. Now, at this hour of the evening, it's very difficult to read my handwriting, but I will do my best. Yes. One thing I think that perhaps we could look at as well in considering possible amendments for a later stage of this process is we look at the best practices paper on combating the abuse of NPOs. There is a research paper on that. It's on the FATF website. It tells us exactly what to do, but it goes back to the basic principles of identify your risk. Where's your risk coming from? Is it really that perhaps the legislators want to say the risk might be coming from Islamic groups, but it would sound bad to say it's coming from Islamic groups, so we are registering all NPOs? Well, no. Let us say what we have to say. We've taken an oath to enact laws as we see fit and in accordance with the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago. And if there are Islamic groups which are funding terrorism or financing terrorism, then why should we not say so? If there are groups here funding terrorism in other parts of the world, why should we not say so? I don't see why we have to hide from that at all, and then have all the NPOs up in arms, being treated as if they are operating outside of the law, half of them not consulted and so on, and feeling, I would say, a sense of injury that they are trying to make our space in Trinidad and Tobago more valuable to all of us, and they are made to feel as though their voices should not be heard and should not be taken into account. I don't know what happens to me in the Senate, but once again, I'm losing my voice. So, Mr. Vice President, I don't think it would be useful at this point for me to comment on the clauses of the bill, because we are yet to get the proposed amendments from the Attorney General, and in any event, that time could be used during the committee stage, and I'm sure, well, other people probably also have proposed amendments to make. So I will not do that at this stage. I will simply ask that the points that I have made be taken into consideration by the Honorable Attorney General and his team of drafters for when we get to the later stage. I thank you.
Minister of Trade and Industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, and I'm very pleased to join this debate, which is essentially about non-profit organizations, the registration and the regulation of these NPOs, and other related matters. I'll tell you why I'm very pleased too, because really, at the end of the day, this is about groups of persons helping other persons. That's simply what it is. We just want to put a framework in place, and also on account of other matters, we need to ensure that we do comply with some global requirements. So this has been an interesting debate. I've listened to everyone, and I've really learned from all of the contributions here today. And there were those, of course, Senator Ramdeen and so on, usual hysteria and exaggerating, causing panic in the population and so on, but that's normal, and I expect to hear the same from Senator Mark, but that's okay. But generally, there were great recommendations coming forward from everyone here, and we learned as we went along. And Senator Dave Narine, your point about educating and guiding, absolutely, absolutely necessary. And Senator Vera, who cited the good in the bill, but also cited the negative, causing our Attorney General to come to his feet and beginning to offer solutions, which, of course, at the committee stage, we will attend to. So that was good. But even where other senators had difficulties and great concerns, it caused us to think again. And so, therefore, we really were pleased to hear the views of all. And at the end of the day, when it comes to helping people, why not put something in place to ensure that we do it right? Again, AG, I want to commend you. You were here last night. I don't know how you did it, attending to this civil asset recovery bill at the committee stage, and I thought all parties worked very well. But AG, I commend you yesterday for the work which you did, and you're here again, bringing good legislation which will favor the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And you must be positive on that side. And even many people talked about the punitive fines, and I think already AG is committing to reviewing that, and we intend to solve those matters at the committee stage. So very valuable comments, but God, Senator Haynes not here, but we always hearing about usual thing, very negative, everything is Mama Guide, this is a dictatorship, victimization, etc. I really don't know what kind of mom she'll make, because I think she will scold a lot. So sorry. Yes.
Minister, I'm going to have to...
Yes. Yeah, and I take that back.
Right, just retract. Yeah,
I retract it, but again, I retract it. I was just merely commenting on the scolding. No. Members. Okay. No. Minister, I would just advise you've retracted. Don't even bother to repeat or further comment on that statement. Just move forward with your contribution and try not to let it happen again. Yeah. Continue. And thank you. And again, from Senator Haynes too, and from Senator Chote spoke about these fledgling organizations and the good work that they do, and so on. And I think, again, the AG is going to bring forward legislation to introduce new thresholds, so it doesn't become so onerous on all these all these small groups that do such good work and who are absolutely necessary in terms of the whole social ecosystem that exists now. So again, very, very good comments. So I'm not going to, Mr. Vice President, I'm not particularly going to speak about the legislation per se, because I think the Honourable AG in his presentation, Senator Baptiste Primus, and also Senator West would have dealt with the legislation, and I wait to be corrected by the AG on matters of the legislation. So I'm just going to make a few general comments. And again, to say that Yes, we understand the situation. There are a number of registered organizations, registered non-profit organizations, about 8,000 of them, but there are also a slew of unregistered ones, and those are the ones that we also want to capture in this proposed system of registering the NPOs. And I do believe in registering. I think that there could be nothing negative about that. There's the regulatory aspect of it. There's also the administrative side of it. And I think that it will only do good to ensure that all of them are, in fact, as fledgling as they are, registered. I do propose, I do think that they should all be registered, but perhaps there should not be onerous responsibilities upon them where it comes to financial commitments, not necessarily financial commitments, but financial accountability and so on. So the AG would have spoken about the higher threshold for those persons that receive donations and so on. Yes, he spoke about that, but I think that we're going to attend to the kinds of requirements in terms of financial accountability, and so for the fledgling ones that we necessarily would not have to put that burden on them. And let me make the point that this whole business of non-profit organizations it's big money. And when you look at this from the standpoint of the social sector investment program, I can tell you last year, the allocation was something like $8 to $9 billion served through several ministries, all of them serving people, and the majority of them through non-profit organizations. And that $8 to $9 billion, which I spoke about, does not even include the private sector and the international donors as well. So you can add another $1 billion there. And this is why I say you're talking about a lot of money in this pot, to use the AG's word, of charitable donations coming through NPOs. So it's a tremendous amount of money. And as I said, and in most cases, it's not regulated or under-regulated, and therefore, we want to be careful and to set this very right. As I said before, this civil society ecosystem is really important. It is important to the development of a country. So you may think in terms of just collecting donations and so on, but it goes a long way, especially when you talk about those rural communities and so on. It goes a long way in terms of development and ensuring that monies and so on really reach persons and communities that really need it. So it is an important part of this civil society ecosystem and the development of communities and persons and so on. And so I think it's very, very important, and that's the point I want to make. And we were talking about risk, the point of risk. And I think it was Senator Dayal Singh, Senator David Wright spoke about it, Senator Dayal Singh, and again, Senator Chote. But risk is high among these NPOs. It is high. And there are many NPOs that have gone wrong. And I don't think that we must wait for things to go wrong. I think it's important. We want a fair and just society. We want a regulated society. We want to ensure that there's openness and transparency in all that we do. And that's the kind of society that we want. And we've been pushing legislation along those lines. But there has been risk, and in many ways. And I think someone may have spoken about the Red Cross. Who would think that anything could go wrong within this large multi-billion organization? And it is, and someone would have spoken about the Haiti experience, where you had substantial donations, I think of about $500 million US, and it's only 25%, you wouldn't believe, only 25% really reached the people of Haiti. So when we talk about risk and what could go wrong, and the fact that there's not oversight and so on, That's what we're talking about, because all of the money that were collected for international donors, much of it went into administration and into paying other NPOs to do the work, and they too then had their administrative costs and so on. As I said, 75% did not reach the people. A lot of it went into program expenses and so on. And okay, this is the Red Cross, but it might be happening right under our noses. And the fact is, we want to fix it. And we want to ensure that donated money really goes to the ground and so on. So that's just one case. And there are many others. I can tell you about these cancer charities in the U.S. And of course, this is, in fact, governed by the Federal Trade Commission. They had filed a complaint against these cancer charities. And in fact, they were sham charities. No, as I said, I'm going to speak very broadly because I'm going to come to some clauses, but there's no point repeating what has been said before. I'm driving the point home, policy-wise, as to why it is absolutely necessary. And I'm saying that there are sham charities out there as well. We would not be aware of some of them. Monies are passing, and they're sham charities. In that case, again, I told you that the Red Cross would have been 25% reaching the people. In this case, where there were sham charities, 3%. 3% really reached the cancer patients. And monies went to the owner, not the owners, but the persons who headed these organizations, went to the college tuition of their children. So, again, I'm only saying all of this to show the risk, and the risk is far and wide, because even, and I'm only going to speak to this particular one very briefly, the More Than Me Academy in Liberia, which is well known throughout the world, and it turned out that many girls who attended that academy, well-intentioned as it was, were raped by the Academy's co-founder. At the end of the day, when he died in 2016, they realized he died from AIDS. So the connotations, I'm saying, are serious. And again, if I am to go to the FATF recommendations, it is real. And if again, I give an example of the Pearl of Hope charity, which has to do with financing, which had all to do with financing terrorism in Syria. Which had to do with financing terrorism in Syria.
Yes. As much as I've allowed a little crosstalk while the minister is making a contribution, it's getting to a point now where the minister can't make a contribution. Standing orders do call for silence when someone is making a contribution, but we allow just minute amount of crosstalk. That is part of the process. But right now it's getting to be too much. Minister, continue.
Yeah. And just to wrap up that little example, the leaders of that so-called charity, it was an Islamic charity in France, eventually were charged with financing terrorism. And that brings us to the point of the FATF recommendations and Recommendation 8, which Senator Chote spoke about. And I too have to be guided by the AG because I know not of the details to which you spoke. And so I look forward to the AG's guidance on it, because in my research, and I could quote from it, it spoke to countries should review the adequacy of laws and regulations that relate to non-profit organizations, which the country has identified as being vulnerable to terrorist financing abuse. Countries should apply focused and proportionate measures in line with the risk-based approach to such non-profit organizations to protect them from terrorist financing abuse. So, to my knowledge and to the extent of the research that I had done, it is absolutely required, and it's a necessity. You're saying that you have delved a little deeper, and that our approach is not the right one, but I wait to be guided by the AG on it. Yes?
What document are you looking at so that I can look at it as well?
I just went in very broadly to the 40 recommendations, the 40 FATF recommendations, and recommendation 8 in particular. But as I said, I may not have gone to the depth that you had. But yes, so I wait for elucidation from the Honourable AG. So we think, though, that it's very important that overall that we attend to this whole question of terrorism and not turn a blind eye to it. We certainly can't turn a blind eye to terrorism. Previously, it was considered to be isolated to a particular region. However, it is a growing phenomenon. And as such, as a government, we really have to do our part to ensure that terrorist cells are not funded or enabled knowingly or unknowingly by monies leaving the shores of Trinidad and Tobago. So crime, terrorism, drugs, and money laundering, all of those are big money activities from which governments and citizens have been negatively impacted, and therefore we cannot be too careful. And I think that the bill which is before us today is yet another step in the right direction to minimize the movement of illegal money and to create credibility and transparency within the non-profit sector. So that, again, I'm not going to talk about the establishment of the register and so on. Many people spoke about that. There was attention given to the supervision and registration of the NPOs and so on, the role of the Registrar General, etc. And so I'm not going to go into that. But just again to highlight the point made by Senator Dayal Singh, there really is need for a cultural change in how we approach things. And that's what we're doing here today. But we're very pleased with all the NPOs that are existing in Trinidad and Tobago and the work which they do. There are opportunities for us to contribute to society. Some of us are so busy we don't have the time to do it ourselves, and we look on and we're very happy to contribute. But we want to be satisfied that these organizations are being run well, and it's only when you get that satisfaction that you're going to give more. Private sector companies are going to be very pleased with this, with the framework and the regulation, the regulatory nature of it and the registration and so on, because they too are going to have faith and trust in all of these organizations to do the work which they set about to do. And generally, overall, I want to say that really in a way, we are protecting citizens from being scammed by mischievous entities. As I said, they haven't come to the fore so much in Trinidad, but all across the world we know them. Let's learn from them and let's do the right thing up forward, because many of them use these NPOs to solicit funds and property for their own gain. Let's guard against that. And again, you know, the opposition raised 3 sets of issues. The FIU was the regulator, the question of the disposal of property, and we heard about the lack of consultation. And that lack of consultation, as the AG has said, it has been out there since 2016. I'm not going to go into that any further. There were a few groups that were missed. And however, I think that their presence here today means that they're on board, they're listening, and we are going to act in the best interest of all of these organizations, and I can give you that assurance. But certainly, using the FIU as a regulator, we think appropriate. I know the opposition has an issue with it, but we couldn't find a more appropriate organization. Under the first schedule of the Proceeds of Crime Act, there are a number of businesses that are listed to be supervised by the FIU. Real estate agents, motor vehicle salespersons, gaming houses, pool betting, and so on, jewelers, private members clubs, attorneys at law, accountants, and so on. And again, why? Because all of these organizations and businesses are deemed to be ones where money can flow easily. And that is what we want to be careful about. And again, the FIU, we find to be the most appropriate organization to do this. The function of the FIU is not limited to just the collection and the analysis of financial information, the dissemination of information, and the collection of suspicious transactions and so on, but it is set up, it's an entirely autonomous entity that is set up to do all of these things, and it is governed by the Financial Action Task Force. I mean, we have complete faith in the FIU. They've been operating since 2009, and they're the best ones to supervise activities like anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing, and so on. So that's just to support the fact that we think that this is the FIU is the appropriate organization. I did speak about the fact of the consultation. Just know that the question of the disposal of property, again, there's one point I want to make. I think it's highly unethical that NPOs should be allowed to distribute remaining funds and assets to its board, to its employees, its volunteers, and that kind of thing. And the legislation allows for NPOs where we come to dissolution, that all of the remaining assets and funds must be donated to an NPO of a similar purpose. And that trend is the same in the law with regard to the non-profit law for England and Wales. I looked at it. I looked at the last update in July 2018. Again, the assets of a charity upon its dissolution must be conveyed to another charity or other charities pursuing the same or similar purposes. And so it is as well when I looked at the non-profit law in Canada as well. Again, where the dissolution of a corporation is governed by the applicable federal, provincial, or territorial law, which is what's set up, and it says very clearly, within the entities incorporating documents or bylaws, that it must include a clause stating that upon winding up or upon a loss of registered status, all of the assets must go to another qualified donee as well. So all of these are examples where it is showing that it's a norm that upon dissolution that the property of the NPO is in fact transferred to another NPO. I wanted to make that point. So I know those are some of the concerns that the opposition has had, and I know that the AG will again reinforce what I have said. In concluding, Mr. Vice President, again, I find the bill to be straightforward. It's about regulating, and it's about this creating this registry. Very straightforward. Very, very straightforward. Aimed at ensuring that any elements of crime are removed from this sector of NPOs, and of course, it makes provisions for the sector to thrive and to carry out its intended mandate, which is to benefit citizens. As I said when I first started, this is about groups of persons doing good for other persons. In our Vision 2030, much emphasis is placed on civil society to play an integral role in driving the cultural change that is needed to transform our country into a more productive and a more progressive society. And as such, all of these regulations will ensure that proficient, abled, and impactful organizations are at the helm of this kind of transformation. We want members of the public, as I said before, private organizations, to feel good about the work that is done by NPOs, and to know, and we give them the assurance that there will be sufficient checks and balances via the FIU, via the Registrar General. That's the kind of comfort that, again, will encourage organizations and other persons to give more. And what we'll do as well is to give, as I said before, greater credibility to these NPOs, whether they're large, big, small, oversized or so, but it gives credibility to them. And of course, then accessibility, because you don't mind working with them, right? Again, I know that there were some concerns about the audited financials and so on, but again, I'm going to rely on the AG in closing to introduce the other thresholds, which will make it a lot easier than on the smaller NPOs. Generally, I want to say, Mr. Vice President, that this is straightforward. And this is going to be to ensure that there is good treatment of these organizations, and that they will be in a suitable framework which will allow for transparency and accountability. I thank you.
Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I would like to join, and I thank you for allowing me the opportunity to join this debate on the Non-Profit Organizations Bill 2019, which is an act to provide for the registration of non-profit organizations, the establishment and maintenance of a register of non-profit organizations, the obligations of NPOs, and for related matters. And Mr. Vice President, I'd like to start my debate by responding to one point the Minister of Trade would have raised. And she said that NPOs is big money business. Mr. Vice President, the majority of NPOs in this country is no big money business. It is small temples and masjids and churches. It is little village councils. It is all fours groups. It is cricket groups. These are the ones who build the community. You had a lot of time and you didn't utilize it, so I would like to utilize my time. Yeah. I do apologize. And the minister did say it's big money business. Mr. Vice President, the minister and her colleagues on that side may understand what is big money business. Because as we currently speak, there's a very big building with big money going up somewhere down close to Cipriani. There's a big red building. I believe it's Balize House or something like that. So they're very aware of big money and big money NGOs. But Mr. Vice President, I would like to quote from one of the most one of the greatest souls to ever have stepped foot into this world, Mr. Vice President, and that is Mahatma Gandhi. He is named after that. Maha means great and Atma is his soul. Mahatma Gandhi, and he said, Mr. Vice President, that the best way to find yourself is in the service of others. And if that is not the motto of non-profit organizations, then I don't know what it is, Mr. Vice President. Because persons who join these organizations don't do it because of selfish needs, but because of self-gratification. Because they want to build their country, they want to build their community, they want to champion a cause. But when you have a government who comes to an honorable parliament such as this in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, where we have a constitution which is supposed to respect the democratic rights of individuals, to now come and trample upon those rights, then we on this side will have a serious problem with that, Mr. Vice President. Because you are curtailing, you are interfering, and you are obstructing with persons' rights to properly carry out their causes through these NPOs. And we understand, Mr. Vice President, that terrorist financing, that money laundering, that proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is a global issue. We have reports that it affects us locally. We on the opposition, the next government I should say, we have supported this government when it came to issues of terrorism. We voted together with its opposition when it came to the amendment of the Anti-Terrorism Act. The Attorney General knows that. Mr. Vice President, when the miscellaneous provisions bill came, we tabled amendments to make it a better piece of legislation, Mr. Vice President. And just last night, while the Minister of Trade praised the Attorney General, I too would like the opportunity to praise the Honorable Leader of the Opposition, Kamla Persad-Isesa of Senior Counsel, on piloting over 63 amendments. 63 amendments, Mr. Vice President, to the unexplained wealth bill, Mr. Vice President.
Okay, I'm on my feet. Senator Mark, respect the fact that I'm on my feet. As I've indicated throughout the course of the day, crosstalk every now and again spices up the debate. But when it gets to a point where the member who's contributing cannot even do so properly, then it's counterproductive. So can we have some silence as the member makes his contribution. Senator, continue.
I'm grateful for your protection, Mr. Vice President. And yes, I was congratulating the leader of the opposition because at the end of the day, when we take a bipartisan approach, you can see that the country will benefit because we have good legislation being passed through this parliament. And Mr. Vice President, we must understand that these NPOs are what we can consider the bedrock of our democracy and our society. And I was on the point earlier that yes, there may be need for some regulation, but when the regulation comes in a form of bill like this, it is almost like a shell shock. Because at the same time you're asking these NPOs to be registered, you are then imposing severe criminal fines for administrative issues. Fines up to 7 years imprisonment and $50,000, Mr. Vice President.
53(1)B, Mr. Vice President.
Members, Senator Obika, Senator Mark, a point of order has been raised. There's no need for a response. Allow me to rule on said point of order. Senator Hussain, as you would have heard when I cautioned other members at this late stage of the debate, the risk of tedious repetition is very high. As much as you're now starting your contribution and you're creating that context, be mindful that you want to, when moving forward, focus on solely new points that have not come before. So I will give you a little leeway, but I'm monitoring as well. Continue.
So guided, please, Mr. Vice President. And Mr. Vice President, as I close off that point with respect to the harsh measures being taken to these NPOs through this bill, a lot have been said about consultation, and I would not go into the consultation issue. Suffice it to say that had there been proper consultation, we would not have been here this late. We may have had a proper piece of legislation where we would not have to waste parliamentary time had you listened to these persons. And Mr. Vice President, over the weekend, in my inbox, I received several emails from various organizations. Persons from Facebook reached out to me, Mr. Vice President, asking us on the opposition, can you please stop this bill? Imagine that. You have the civil society in this country saying...
53(1)B?
Yes, Attorney General. Senator Mark, no. Senator Mark. I will not tolerate these kinds of outbursts. This is not the place for them. Senator Hussain, the points that you're raising now have been said before by a lot of members. I think you are the 13th or 14th speaker. So a lot of what you're saying has been said. I'm going to ask and strictly enforce that new points be raised. Continue.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's the objective.
You want to shut down everybody? I feel it is.
I'm going to have to ask that there be silence in the chamber, period. No more comments, and I'm going to aggressively enforce that for the rest of the night. Senator Hussain, continue.
Mr. Vice President, I had no idea my contribution would have attracted so much attention from the members of the other bench. But if I were to go on, Mr. Vice President, this bill has a lot to do with the prevention of terrorism. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have very robust laws when it comes to terrorism. I would like to think that in the Caribbean region, our country has the most robust laws when it comes to terrorism. And this bill seeks to tackle terrorism through these NPOs, the financing of terrorism, that aspect of it. Now, respectfully, we have heard from the Attorney General when it comes to the FIU reports of the suspicious transaction reports, 23 billion. But are we really addressing what is the mischief of this bill besides CFATF compliance? Are we really creating or addressing a problem that we don't have? Is there any evidence or is there any matters before the court in which an NPO was charged based on financing a terrorist organization? Has there been any NPOs in Trinidad and Tobago that is accused or convicted of money laundering or proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? Something that is still a figment of some person's imagination. Mr. Vice President, and we have to understand that when we make laws in this country, the Attorney General is vested with a power given to him by the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, not based on the mutual evaluation report of FATF or CFATF, Mr. Vice President. Your powers derive from the Constitution. You must listen to the people before you make laws. You must understand that when you are making laws, that you are making laws to regulate behavior. So are we making laws to regulate a city?
Senator Ramley's exact speech.
What?
Oh, what? Senator Ramley never raised his voice.
Members, again, there's a procedure when raising a point of order. The point of order is raised, and I will rule on that point of order. There's no need for commentary outside of that. All it does is lengthen the time and takes away from the members' speaking time. So the point of order has been raised. Attorney General, I will allow him to continue so that I can hear the argument that he's taking. Continue, Senator.
And Mr. Vice President, at this point when it comes to regulating these NPOs because of financing of terrorism, you would understand that besides NPOs, we are largely non-compliant with Regulation 8 when we look at the last mutual evaluation report done in 2016. Trinidad and Tobago is non-compliant. But then we enact laws to deal with terrorism and terrorist financing. And you would see almost every Monday morning in the newspaper ads published that the Attorney General Office has seized various assets of terrorist groups or individuals or entities. Some are organizations who may be considered NPOs. Mr. Vice President, I even understand that the assets of Hamza bin Laden, who is the son of Osama bin Laden, has been seized in Trinidad and Tobago. I don't know, after all of those 96 orders that were made, how much property was actually seized in Trinidad and Tobago. And Mr. Vice President, when you look at that, you only see, and I'm very careful here, but there's a perception, and Senator Chote touched on it, that when you see these things happening, there's a certain perception that is given to the public where all the names of organizations who are almost listed are related to an Islamic name, Mr. Vice President, and it's very dangerous. And that sets a tone, it sets a narrative in which how people view the Muslim community. And this bill will touch and concern the Muslim community. And if you would allow me, Mr. Vice President, when I looked at clause 19, subsection 1C, it states, Mr. Vice President, a controller of a non-profit organization shall ensure that records of the following are kept: the source of its gross annual income. Now, for those who may not be aware, Mr. Vice President, my friend Senator Kazim Hussein, he will be aware that when you go into a masjid, there's a box by the door, and the box has about 3 different slots. One is for zakat. Zakat is a mandatory 2.5% of your earnings that we pay every year. Then you will have something called Sadqatul Fit, which is a mandatory sum that we pay before we perform the Eid Salah. Then there's Sadqa, which is just general giving that you can offer on a Friday, Mr. Vice President. And this section is asking a controller for NPO to disclose the source of the income. But Mr. Vice President, when I take my $10 or my $20 and I put it in that box, how it is the controller of that masjid who runs the NPO will be able to disclose the source of the income? How will he know who gave that money? What if I decide to put $10,000 in the box?
I could have sworn that I gave a ruling earlier in relation to the crosstalk I'm not getting up to speak again. Rest assured. Absolute silence. Senator Hussain, continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, and do you know when you, and this is one of the onerous sections that I have an issue with, because if you breach that provision in the law, the controller will be liable to $50,000 or to 7 years imprisonment. And that is a very dangerous clause in which we have in the bill. I know, Mr. Vice President, when you're dealing with wire transfers, for example, let's just use a bank in Miami and a bank in Trinidad, it will be easy to detect those transactions because you know who is the sender, who is the receiver, and vice versa, Mr. Vice President. And these are the issues that the sensitive... Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Mr. Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 14.5, I beg to move that the Senate continue to sit until the AG concludes his reply or wrap-up of this debate. And then we'll move on to the matters on the adjournment.
Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate continues to sit until the AG wraps up his reply, inclusive of the matters on the adjournment. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Senate will continue to sit until the AG wraps up, inclusive of the matters on the adjournment. Senator Hussain.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I'm getting more exercise than you today. The amount of time I had to sit and stand. The next clause that I want to move on to is clause 6, subsection 2E, Roman 3, which states that it deals with the power to grant or renew registration, and this power is given to the Registrar General. And the Registrar General may refuse to register or renew an applicant as an NPO if it suggests or implies a connection with the state or the government or of any ministry, department, branch, bureau, service, agency, or activity of the government, unless consent in writing to the proposed name is duly obtained from the appropriate minister. But, Mr. Vice President, you will be aware, and most of us in this Honorable House will be aware, that there have been NPOs who have been affiliated, who would have some connection with the state in terms of financing and resources. And, Mr. Vice President, someone passed me these documents, which is the registered documents from the company's registry of the Calabar Foundation. And the Calabar Foundation, one of the mandates of this NPO is that it is restricted to activities geared to securing both social and infrastructural improvements for poor and impoverished communities through means which include acquiring financial and other resources, collaboration with other organizations and agencies, and implementing projects and programs in targeted areas and communities. And Mr. Vice President, when you read that and you see all of the returns that have been filed and so on with respect to this foundation, it is completely on the face of it innocent that you would never know that this organization may have had some connection with regards to the state. So then how does the Registrar General now be able to detect whether or not this enterprise has some connection with the state? Is there some mandatory disclosure in which has to be made with respect to these NPOs stating that, well, we are affiliated with the state? And if I want to hide and say, well, look, I get money through some minister or some high government official, then you're not disclosing all those facts to the Registrar General. And that is one of the operational issues I have with respect to the legislation. Also, when you look at the Heliconia Foundation, one foundation very familiar to the People's National Movement. I know my friend, Senator Foster Cummings, is a director on the Heliconia Foundation. And he will also have to disclose that that NPO, when being registered, is affiliated with the state or with some political party, Mr. Vice President. And I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that because when you have things like that operating, Mr. Vice President, and we heard earlier on when the sitting started, that there have been funding for certain events and so on, you have to wonder whether or not these political parties are funding themselves or whether or not NPOs are funding these political parties. And it's just an anecdotal evidence that I'm giving to you, Mr. Vice President. I'm not casting any aspersions on anyone. Now, there's a very wide power also given to the Registrar General. And this wide power is found also in Clause 6, which deals with the renewal and the power to grant or renew registration. And this power, Mr. Vice President, is that if a name, in the opinion of the Registrar General, for any reason objectionable is objectionable, that means that the Registrar General would not register. He or she has a power to not register that NPO. And now I would like to find out what will amount to something that is objectionable, or what is any reason for non-registration, because that leaves a very wide arbitrary power to the Registrar General. Because if I have been running this association, X, and then on re-registration, another Registrar General sees the name, so Registrar General 1 grants me the registration of the NPO. 3 years elapse, you go to re-register, and then Registrar 2 says, well, there's a new Registrar General, and she says, well, look, I do agree with this name. Then what happens to me, Mr. Vice President? So these are very arbitrary powers that should be cut down when it comes to the legislation. And these are the issues that we will have raised on this side, Mr. Vice President. When you go on, also, Clause 7. Clause 7 deals with the re-registration of the NPOs. And I said earlier, every 3 years you register the NPO. Mr. Vice President, what happens if an NGO, for example, a lot of NGOs or village councils, they have these little coups, because one day, 6 of us here, we run the village council, and one of them gave X, and they form their own village council, and the whole village council mash up, and they get a new executive the next morning. Mr. Vice President, and this is a very common thing, you know, right? Because if you're playing in a cricket side, and I didn't get a bat, well, I want to mash up the whole organization. And that is how these things operate, Mr. Vice President. And what if you have some of the members who are holding on to the paper? Because in Trinidad and Tobago, people hold on to paper. You just come by the lawyer and say, well, my sister or my brother had the paper and they want to give me. Not knowing that deed is a public document, but they want to give me the deed. You hear it commonly. And you would have some of these persons who hold on to paper. And what if the 3-year period expired and the new executive, the new controllers of the NPO, is unaware that they had to re-register the NPO? Then what happens to them? Because the bill doesn't provide for late registration, whether or not they will be allowed a period of extension for registration. And these are issues that we must be cognizant about, because if you look at the NPOs, they are very concentrated, especially in the rural areas of Trinidad and Tobago. In the rural areas, Mr. Vice President. Yeah. And when you go on, Mr. Vice President, you will see, with respect to the cancellation of the registration, and that is a very draconian power, Mr. Vice President, because on cancellation of the registration, property can subsequently be forfeited. When you look at this section, at clause 22, subsection 3, it states, the Attorney General shall be required to name as respondents. Subsection 2, where the registration of a non-profit organization is cancelled under subsection 10(1)(a), (b), (c), (f), or (g), the Attorney General shall make an application to a judge of the High Court for an order of forfeiture in respect of the property of an NPO. Now, Mr. Vice President, why the Attorney General? Why should the Attorney General be the one to make this application to forfeit property? Because you know what flows from that, Mr. Vice President? It goes into receivership, or it goes before the High Court. Look at the powers that the court has now. The court has the power. The property of a non-profit organization forfeited to the state shall be given or transferred to such other NPO as determined by a judge. Now, let's look at this practically. A judge is sitting in the High Court. we have two attorneys and you're trying to convince the court how this property is to be forfeited. What factors are the judge going to take into consideration when they determine which organization shall we give this property to? And that is a serious consideration because, yes, you're going to leave it up to judicial discretion, but what guides the court? What are the factors that will guide the judge? What are some of the elements that a person will require to depose in his affidavit or his witness statement to determine how to convince the court how the property should go? There are no stated criteria when it comes to that, Mr. Vice President. And again, that is the vague provisions that we have in the bill. Let me go on to Clause 13. Clause 13 deals with appeals. Several members of the Senate would have dealt with the expense of an appeal for these NPOs to retain counsel to represent them on an appeal. But I have some issues that I would like to raise that was probably left out from the legislation. How is this right of appeal to be triggered in the High Court? Within what time frame is the appeal to be lodged? On what grounds will the right of appeal be based? What is the jurisdiction that the High Court will be exercising? Will it be limited to review, or will it have jurisdiction to consider the application afresh? Will there be an appeal from the High Court to the Court of Appeal and then to the Privy Council? What is the nature of the relief that the court has the power to grant? Will the court have the power to stay the decision of the registrar pending the appeal, Mr. Vice President? And this issue with respect to the appeal is one of the only safeguards that a person who is a controller of an NPO has, because it's the only avenue in which he can go forward with respect to challenging a decision of the Registrar General. And when you look at Clause 14 of the, when we look at, again, the forfeiture provisions, Mr. Vice President, I had the opportunity to examine the Cayman Island legislation that Senator Mark would have spoken about. And in this case, it works that you reach a certain provision of the law that requires forfeiture. Attorney General makes the application for forfeiture. Then, in Cayman Islands, you see, before the property is forfeited, notice must be given to the NPO. And after notice is being given, then the Attorney General can step in. I wonder whether or not this provision is contained right here in the legislation. Because when you look at the ultimate aim in which you're trying to achieve, this legislation surpasses what FATF probably requires. Because FATF requires certain very basic elements, such as a risk assessment, such as consultation with the stakeholders. Even FATF, they consulted with the world at large on their website. They sent out a notice for public consultation on Recommendation 8, Mr. Vice President. And that is what would have influenced the document that most of the senators would have referred to, which is this document in my hand, the interpretive note to Recommendation 8. And this would have guided several jurisdictions on ways in which they would have implemented their legislation that regulates and treats with these non-profit organizations. And this was not done here, Mr. Vice President. And what troubled me the most during the Attorney General's piloting of this bill was that he gave the country the impression that we are going to pass this law, but we are not going to proclaim it. No, that is our mama guy, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Hussain, that particular line of argument, the comments made by the Attorney General in relation to blacklisting and the fact that other senators have indicated it's not entirely the case, that commentary and that line and that argument has been used. So if you have another point to make, I'd ask you to move forward now.
And the simple point is that when we are going to be evaluated by FATF, because we fall in that basin, we have two elements that we have to satisfy. That is Trinidad and Tobago. We have to satisfy technical compliance, which means that we pass the law. But the other limb is effectiveness. So how can you on one hand say that we are going to pass the legislation, put it on the books, but you're not going to proclaim it? Then we will fail on the limb of effectiveness. So we'll be half-baked. The Attorney General like to say, can't be half pregnant, Mr. Vice President. And this is simply not the case, right, Mr. Vice President? This is simply not the case. You have to comply with the both limbs in order to be fully compliant. Right now, we are non-compliant. I could probably predict that based on all of the legislation we passed so far, Trinidad and Tobago will not be in the gray list. We will move forward from that. But at the end of the day, when you look at recommendation 8, we will only be partially compliant. We would not be fully compliant. There are different grades in which FATF will grade a country when they evaluate based on the improvements that they did with respect to their financial sector and their legislative framework. And Mr. Vice President, there has been several criticisms with respect to the indecent haste that we always come to this Parliament at the last minute saying that there's a deadline. And Mr. Vice President, we are fed up of that. Manage your legislative agenda. That is what we ask for. That is what we ask for. And the thing is that this debate was a very sensible debate. It gave the country some hope, I would say, because it shows that there are persons in this Parliament, maybe not on that side, but on this side, who care for civil society, Mr. Vice President, and who care for democracy, and who care for the rights and freedoms and the liberties of individuals, Mr. Vice President. And I would now like to conclude, and I hope that you give me the opportunity, Mr. Vice President. And just like Senator Ramdeen, I received the pocket edition for Vision 2030. Now, this can't fit in my pocket. And it says, when I open the first page, it says, imagine.
I know what you're trying to do, and even where Senator Ramdeen would have used even the same angle, pick up the pocketbook, read something from the pocketbook, and indicate that it's contrary to what is being happening. As much as you're making your closing argument, again, I have to strictly enforce anything that goes down the line of what other members have done. Senator Ramdeen, actually in the beginning of his contribution, started off using that context, that line, that type of argument. If you want to close, go ahead and close. You don't have to use the pocketbook or that argument of what's in the pocketbook is contrary to what is going on now. We're really trying to get to the end of the debate without the tedious repetition for arguments that have gone before. Continue.
It's just one line I would like to quote from, and I would close. And it just says, imagine a Trinidad and Tobago where all citizens enjoy a high standard of living and have equal opportunity for self-actualization, where corruption is minimal or non-existent, and service standards are high, where people dispose of garbage in a environmentally responsible manner, simple because they see the value of nature and natural resources. Mr. Vice President, in conclusion, this imagination can only be a realization if we get rid of this current PNM government. I thank you very much.
Senator Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for recognizing me. 3 minutes to 8 o'clock, which means we are at hour number 10 in what has been a long debate, so I will not be particularly long. I'll take a note from my colleague, Senator C. Prasad, and be very short. Let me start by going in a different direction. And I'll quote a little political theory to hopefully wake up some minds at this very late hour. The overturned window is a range of ideas or policies that may be tolerated or accepted as the window of public discourse. The idea's political or public viability depends on if that idea or policy falls within the range of radical, acceptable, sensible, popular, useful, or functional. And how the policy or law or idea is presented, how it comes about, significantly impact how it is received and accepted in the window of radical, acceptable, sensible, popular. And it's by a theorist named Joseph P. Overton. And one of the things we need to learn from this, because I don't think anyone disagrees with the fact that the time has come for legislation regarding NPOs. That has been stated over and over. But I think we can learn that and I'm not going to go into the tedious repetition trap, that if we do not act in an inclusive manner, we will always find what may be very palatable legislation and policy being subjected to a certain level of resistance. So let me go into I just jotted down 10 quick points to underscore. We live in a world of the unthinkable. I know many people have said, well, you know, NPOs, non-profit organizations are either small, medium, or large-size organization, but, you know, we have to make law through you, Mr. Vice President, for any possible eventuality in this kind of world we live in. 20 years ago, we didn't conceive that people would fly planes into buildings. We couldn't think of the things that are happening in the world now. And as benign, and I'm not casting a brush of doubt on the value of NPOs in Trinidad and Tobago, any jurisdiction, but we have to understand that the criminal element in the world is very creative and will use any opportunity to proffer their evil ways. And we have to understand that is the paradigm in which we're operating, and make laws to prevent that or to protect the integrity of agencies like NPOs. And you know, part of the debate early on by some persons centered on the amount of money, and I would like a kind of disaggregation the AG in his wind-up could provide, because he indicated that $544.7 million was given to, and I got the impression it was NGOs, but then his colleague, Senator West, said directly and indirectly, and I'm a very specific person when it comes to English language. So I'm wondering if it's NGOs or social intervention mechanisms that received the $544.7 million. Absolutely, thank you.
It is actually the NGO sector under the heads of those specific ministries. So under the program as set out by the Social Sector Investment Program as published, under each ministry, they then list out the exact entities that receive it. For instance, DRECI, Data Center Storage Area Network, Social Enterprise Management System, Socially Displaced Centers, Integration Projects. So they're actually listed, and they are properly under the ministry's initiatives set out there for actual expenditure. So it's both, but it's all properly in that NGO sector.
Thank you very much, Honorable AG. I appreciate the clarification. And the debate centered upon whether the NGOs are receiving this level of funding because of gaps. Well, I don't see them being mutually exclusive. One, it develops capacity at some level because I think it's an investment into the public for remediation in many, many areas. It builds cohesiveness and capacity in particularly rural communities. So I think if under the right framework, even this level of investment or more in a more regulated framework and a more accountable framework can provide significant gains, because sometimes we always like to count the money aspect of it, the financial aspect of it, and don't realize there are sometimes even more valuable intangibles to be gained by this level of investment. But that doesn't mean that the state shouldn't be doing its job. So I just wanted to clarify that. And I think with that said, the issue of the FIU or the Registrar General's division really, and I would like to see this spelled out specifically, although it may come in the regulations, of some sort of mechanism spelled out to provide technical support, capacity building, financial training for the small NGOs, even those registered under the $10 million benchmark. Because if we are to build the capacity of these agencies that are doing such good work and ask them to be more accountable, I think it's incumbent upon us to put specifics in place to ensure that the technical support and the capacity building is actually built in to the accountability factor. And I haven't seen that there, and I don't know if it will come under the remit of the FIU in this new incarnation, or if it will come under the Registrar General's Department. But it's not specified, and I think it's an opportunity that would be wasted if we do not include it in that way. Also, there had been some debate through you, Mr. Vice President, about whether there should be a benchmark for registration. In my opinion, every entity wanting to do this kind of work should be registered. There's nothing not to be gained by it. There should be different tiers, as others have indicated. I won't go into that because it has been distilled quite a bit. But I think every entity wanting to either collect monies to disburse for particular causes should have a registration process. The accountability levels, to me, need to be different for different levels. But I think there's nothing wrong with having a registry and every entity registered. So if someone sees, well, X entity is raising funds or collecting funds for Y, they can go to this registry and say, well, this is a bona fide organization, and it's less likely that I will be tricked and my monies will go exactly where it's intended to go. So that's my recommendation on that. I have concerns about the $10 million benchmark as articulated by the Attorney General. I think $10 million is a lot of money to have to present audited financials at that benchmark. I really think that should be lower. Some may say it's onerous, but I think in a financial year, if an organization is collecting $4 or $5 million, I think the benchmark for financial accountability should be applied even there. Because there's a lot of malfeasance that can happen just before the $10 million mark without financial accounts being supplied. And I know companies that make less than that have to provide a lot more stringent financial accountability. And I don't see a discrepancy where that is concerned. So I would suggest that be even lower in the context of accountability where it's concerned. One of the points I didn't hear made earlier on, and I want to quote from a document, is the issue of the digital inflows into NGOs. You know, the largest global international NGO, World Vision International, had 46,000 staff members and a global budget of US $2.57 billion in 2010. It's increased significantly since then. And the 7 large countries, Brazil, People's Republic of China, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, and United Arab Emirates, funds mobilized for international development by NGOs were estimated at least $1.4 billion in 2011. However, this was the context of contribution for domestic causes at around $35 billion a year in development initiatives by 2013. So you see, monies being raised internationally by NGOs from the state and otherwise private sector are increasing significantly. And we have to pay attention to those trends. One of the areas I did not see mentioned specifically, which I think there's an accountability gap in this bill, is the issue of, I think Senator Vera referenced it briefly, is the crowdfunding issue and the evolution of entities like GoFundMe in the local context. And I know several people in Trinidad and Tobago have accessed, in one case, $95,000 US in Trinidad and Tobago for medical intervention for their family member. And I don't know if that is going under the radar in terms of an accountability factor in Trinidad and Tobago. There is a document that says Kiva, which is kiva.org, is among the many internet-based platforms that is now being used by individuals globally to give money, and they're leveraging the internet and a worldwide network of microfinance institutions. It lets individuals lend as little as US $25 to micro-entrepreneurs and also NGOs. And it has now reached over 70 countries, to the sum of $552 million US by October of 2005. There's also a counterpart called Zedisha, which took the Kiva model and also has now 7,761 registered lenders, and it is now providing aid in several countries around the world. So if we think that locals and small groups and individuals who are doing NPO work are not accessing these agencies and these international opportunities without accountability, we are fooling ourselves. And one of the concerns from UNICEF is that because of the opportunities that are coming through these agencies internationally to countries like Trinidad and Tobago, developing countries, without the legislative framework in place, it is very easy for terrorist financing to slip in through these online portals if the safeguards are not in place. We have to be very careful with that is concerned. As I said, as I started, the criminal element, locally, regionally, internationally, take advantage of every loophole in your jurisdiction to do their evil. And we need to be very careful with that is concerned. There was a lot of commentary on the need for a tiered system as opposed to a across the board. During the tea break, I know the Attorney General was indicating that he's open to quite a few amendments at the committee stage. And I think the importance of overall oversight is good. But we have to think 5 years and 10 years down the road as to how much more significant a role these NPOs and NGOs are going to play in Trinidad and Tobago as the demands in our population increase. Just look at the situation with migrant brothers and sisters from Venezuela and the impact that is having on our social services and our state resources. And the fact that NGOs are going to have to play a more significant role in mitigating the load placed by these migrants in our systems in Trinidad and Tobago, and where these NPOs are going to get this funding from to continue their good works. And we also have to think in terms of widening the gamut of the work NPOs can do through a more effective and forward-thinking legislative framework to give them room to grow, to fund education and innovation within the NPO environment so that they can grow into more significant contributors to Trinidad and Tobago's development in the future. Because they have, if you take out the NPO sector from Trinidad and Tobago, we would have serious implications in Trinidad and Tobago. We would have severe hardships. My closing point is that when we go from zero to so punitive in such a short time, and we don't provide the support mechanisms and the capacity building, and NPOs fall through the cracks or become deregistered or can't operate, what is the mechanism in place for the beneficiaries of these NPOs? If out of the 8,000, 2,500 say, I can't operate no more, and they are servicing X amount of people, what is going to happen to those people? And we haven't put systems in place to deal with that possible fallout. And we have to be very cognizant of that possibility, because I am of the firm belief that, one, registration fall should be a must, and two, not all the NPOs that are operating should be operating, quite frankly. Fact of life. Should not be, either through malfeasance or just are not able to cope effectively and maybe doing more damage than good. So we have to take all of that into consideration in terms of who they are presently serving, which may run into the thousands if we do not put systems in place for the fallout of those that will not meet the benchmarks that we're trying to establish by this legislation. And with those few words, Mr. Vice President, I thank you.
Senator Obika.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. And I do recognize that I'm coming down the batting order. So
Number 11.
I want to start by taking note of the Attorney General's commitment to bring some amendments to this bill, Mr. Vice President. And, you know, I'm sure you'll have heard all the submissions, so he's aware that this bill needs much work. So I encourage the Attorney General to bring those amendments. I know in life, Mr. Vice President, process and system is very important. The process through which those amendments are brought, really and truly, I would encourage the Attorney General to find himself at the office of the Prime Minister to get approval. We don't want what happened yesterday to happen again today with this bill. And before going there, Temple Court contains the office of another minister, Minister Stuart Young. And I understand that between Minister Young and Minister Al-Rawi,
and on Standing Order 53-1B, both.
Now, as much as in opening remarks of any contribution, there is a wide berth that is usually given. Senator Obika, it's becoming extremely difficult to find the relevance in what you're saying to what we have, especially as you've indicated that you are coming in very late in the stage of the debate. So I'll ask you to just speed it up to the benefit of everyone in the chamber. Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The sum of what I'm saying is we want to ensure that we've used the entire day in Parliament on working on a piece of legislation that actually gets implemented, that actually gets proclaimed. And because of the conflict between the future leaders of the PNM, because we understand Faris Al-Rawi and Stuart Young
Senator
are fighting for that position.
Not only along the line of relevance, I'll have to caution you on, but in terms of repetition, that very same irrelevant argument has been said before. So again, move quickly into the meat of your contribution at this late stage of the proceedings. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I will take the opportunity to go into something that has not been addressed in this debate. Right. All right? And that has to do with self-regulation. And where do I take this from? The whole issue of self-regulation actually comes from the FATF Recommendation 8. And unfortunately, none of the prior contributors made reference to this. And to me, it brings me great consternation, because really and truly, one would have expected that. But I will pause that point for the moment to deal with a specific clause. And that is clause 24, part 2. All right? And clause 24, part 2, not much persons reference it, if any at all. It's really a catch-all. So in essence, and I will just read from the clause itself, but I will say what it says in essence. In essence, if, Mr. Vice President, you find that the law does not permit you to be caught specifically or directly as a controller, for many of the offenses listed in this entire bill, they will catch you by the tail in clause 24, subsection 2. And this is what it says. Any controller, unquote, any controller of a non-profit organization who knowingly or recklessly authorizes, acquiesces in or permits the contravention of this act, which constitutes an offense by a non-profit organization, commits that offense and is liable to be proceeded against and punished accordingly unless otherwise expressly provided. So basically, if they miss it with the 23 before, they catch in here on clause 24. So that's the devious nature of this bill. So let me go straight into the issue of self-regulation. And I take this from Recommendation 8, and it's a paper on best practices on combating the abuse of non-profit organizations of FATF. All right? And I turn specifically to page 24 of that paper. And there's an example on NPO self-regulation. Right? And what it speaks to are measures to strengthen effective NPO self-regulation, and FATF is saying that these should be encouraged. They should be encouraged as a significant component in decreasing the risk, because much has been made. Much has been made. Senator Vieira, for example, has referenced the issue of mitigation and so on regarding risk. Senator Richards, I believe, mentioned the tiered system, or is it Senator Chote? All right? So Senator Richards. So basically, much has been made of that. But FATF is providing, Mr. Vice President, an alternative, just as in the law we have alternative dispute resolution, all right, which can be used in tandem with the criminal justice system or the justice system. We have a remedy here that can bring the NGOs along. And what it says here is that some examples and initiatives, and I won't bore us with all of them. I will just take some of the points they referenced. All right. And what they said is that, in conclusion, the process of applying for and maintaining good standing in the program that is for self-regulation, encourages NPOs to regularly review and improve the systems and policies that they have in place. Now, Mr. Vice President, if we had decided to go down this road, then of course, what you would find is that most of the submissions brought forward by the non-profit organizations really and truly are in harmony with this. The unfortunate thing is that they did not spell it out explicitly, all right? So they actually are thinking in harmony with FATF, but they probably didn't have the luxury or the benefit of seeing this actual section. And because I'm always for alternatives to penalizing persons, I went to that. And there's another document I just want to quote from, all right? And this is current trends in self-regulation of civil society organizations in Europe. I'll give the author. I just want to quote this section if I go to the first page. And it says here, working groups. So it speaks to the concept of working groups, all right? And working groups are CSO alliances. We call them networks of NGOs in Trinidad and Tobago. Working groups are alliances of and I quote, working groups are CSO alliances that meet regularly to exchange best practices and discuss various common concerns. They are more flexible and accessible, and they often result in a deeper cooperation between the members. Success of working groups highly depends on the leadership, regularity of the meetings, and ability of the members to reach a consensus. And that document, Mr. Vice President, is titled The Current Trends in Self-Regulation of Civil Society Organizations in Europe, a General Overview by the European Center for Not-for-Profit Law. All right, so this is not a fly-by-night way of thinking. Really and truly, what I'm advocating for is something that is well-researched and, to me, deserves a second look. Now, I want to respond in brief to the assertion of the Honorable Attorney General at the beginning of his presentation. He came with the usual brouhaha about the sky will fall. Yeah. And the people of Trinidad and Tobago, at this point, Mr. Vice President, will do well to hearken to the words, to listen very carefully to the words of that Aesop fable. That Aesop fable that speaks about the boy who cried wolf and the actions of the Attorney General in bringing these financial, these laws that require persons who are involved in pecuniary interests in organizations to come before the courts, to be jailed and so on, to comply with FATF, CFATF, Global Forum, and FATCA and so on, the way in which they are brought at the last minute, supposedly. And then, of course, the claims that the sky will fall, really and truly, is akin to the juvenile, the same young boy who cried wolf so many times that they could not believe the integrity of his cries. So the people of Trinidad and Tobago have a trust issue with the Attorney General. Yes. All right, so I want to move on from that point. I see the Attorney General is back. He really enjoyed my opening statement. So, Mr. Vice President, what I look at is Clause 3. All right, and Clause 3 is the interpretation clause, as we all know. And under Clause 3, it explains and outlines what is an NPO. I wouldn't go into that because many senators before, including Senator Thompson-Ahye, ran through the verbatim of it. All right? And it speaks to, but one word I want to pick out here is pecuniary gain. Now, financial gain, let's use the layman term, because if you ask the man in the street or even in the office what is pecuniary gain, he will ask you for the dictionary or he'll show you the door. So, financial gain, there are many organizations that are organized for financial gain. And there are some particular organizations I want to point to. Very interesting organizations, Mr. Vice President, that are organized for financial gain. And that really arose from the contribution of the Minister of Labor. So if I can just jump to that contribution. The Honorable Minister of Labor spoke about cooperatives and friendly societies. All right? So friendly societies are a dying breed in Trinidad and Tobago, but the ones that are active are doing human service, especially in the areas of insurance, death benefit, and so on, as the Honorable Minister pointed out. But I want to take issue with the contribution of the Minister in the cooperative sector, all right? Because really and truly, I don't see where the cooperative sector is relevant to this bill before us. They're already being regulated in a division of under the Minister's Department, the Department of Cooperatives. They already present financial statements, all right? That is the financial cooperative sector. The non-financial cooperative sector, which are the credit unions, the non-credit union type organizations, may be relevant. But the Minister did not complete the statement. What the Minister should have explained then is what would be the damage to the non-credit unions. So the cooperative sector that is not relevant is the credit unions. They are covered. They are properly watched by the FIU, by the Ministry of Labor, and in a very odd arrangement by the central bank. But in non-financial cooperatives, Mr. Vice President, it would surprise you to know that there are many fishing cooperatives that were created since the days of Eric Williams that are defunct, exist on the books, actually have real assets, and that are being reactivated from time to time once the descendants or persons who lived in the area of the fishing cooperative founders could be found, could be energized, and could be refocused. If, however, we take the stance that even these organizations, should they, in the Minister's view, fall under this legislation, should be struck off the books after 3 years if they don't report, then really are you saying that we're going to basically, we can preside over the closure of many a non-financial cooperative? And even from your professional interest, Mr. Vice President, you are a man regarding maritime interests, the sea, fisheries. Most of the cooperatives in your area, your professional area, will be closed because many of them do not function properly. So I think the Honorable Minister should have stated that. But of course, the Minister didn't want to sound as if she are with us, the future government of Trinidad and Tobago, United National Congress.
No, we don't. No, you can stay right there. You can stay right there.
So one must come to one conclusion, that the Minister should be given a copy of the bill so that she can be familiar with some of the sections. There's another point the Minister made regarding that is not, I quote, is not a parlor you're selling, unquote. However, it has been established in this debate, Mr. Vice President, that many of the organizations that we are dealing with here are even much smaller than a regular village parlor in the countryside in this country. So that's the point I really wanted to bring to bear on that issue. Now,
come on.
Now, Mr. Vice President, as the Honourable Minister indicated, I would encourage the Minister to look into the affairs in her ministry, because it would surprise you to know, Mr. Vice President, that as we speak, the cooperatives in this country is without a substantive commissioner for cooperatives. And therefore, the non-financial cooperatives cannot borrow under this PNM government. They are prevented from borrowing outside of their membership base, which really goes against the whole tenets of the cooperative movement. Because I have served in a capacity of an organization that gives loans to cooperatives. And are you saying that these cooperatives that form this organization, which is itself a cooperative, did so illegally under this PNM government? This incarnation of the PNM government, cooperatives are prevented from doing their rightful business. As the leader of our bench said, Eric Williams is probably turning in his grave because he created the platform for these cooperatives in this country. So the government needs to check the Minister of Labor, because what they are doing is damage to the cooperatives in this country. I couldn't let that point pass. So I want to move on to the statements from the United Nations regarding Clause 9. All right? And the issue of, Clause 19, regarding jailing persons, imprisonment. All right? And from the document titled, so from the Committee on Non-Governmental Organizations, which was established by ECOSOC resolution, of the terms of reference have been reviewed several times, and there's a framework, a FATF framework, which basically develops from that for civil society, which we all spoke to recommendation 8. Under best practices, the paper on combating the abuse of non-profit organizations, the Financial Action Task Force. So the FATF created a report regarding abuse of NPOs and terrorist financing. They reference the Canadian system. And I listened to the Honorable Minister of Trade, Senator, the Honorable Paula Gopee-Scoon, and she referenced the Canadian system as well, Mr. Vice President. And when you look at this report regarding the abuse of non-profit organizations, it says here, and I quote, and I'll explain thereafter, if a charity that is already registered does not comply with the requirements of registration for any reason, including connections to terrorism, the division can apply a range of regulatory interventions. So they went even to the highest level of connections to terrorism, all right? They said including education letters, compliance agreements, which is to modify behavior, monetary penalties, which we have in this legislation, although harsh, and in the most serious cases, revocation of registration. There is no mention made there of imprisonment. No mention. For administrative failures, not for criminal offenses. So what this bill does is criminalize that. And it goes on. If the division encounters information that is relevant to a terrorism investigation when carrying out these regulatory duties, it has the authority to share that information with national security partners and law enforcement agencies. We have the anti-terrorism bill, as Senator Chote pointed out to us. So really and truly, why are we bringing the whole issue of jail time? And it begs the question as to the real motive. What is the real motive of this bill? All right? At the beginning of the presentation, the Attorney General, I don't know if he was headline grabbing, mentioned $500 million from the state. I'm not sure if all of that goes to government programs or goes to or NGOs. So unless because of my background in finance, Mr. Vice President, I would require disaggregation of that line item. I can't accept wholesale that $500 million goes to NGOs from the state unless I can see how the funds are being distributed. But notwithstanding that, if we had to take that figure as this, at face value, it begs the question, what is the real motive of the bill? Is it that the government is watching the money of the people's sector and finding that the people don't deserve $500 million coming to them? I mean, it begs the question. So really and truly, is it that because the government is trying to turn the screws tighter on the small man, increasing taxes, now taking away the small man's access to his only way of contributing to a better life and a better Trinidad and Tobago? And that carries me to my next point. Because for us to understand and appreciate where we are today, Mr. Vice President, we must always benefit from the lessons of history. It is because of history that we are here. It is because 115 years ago, the Ratepayers Association, another NGO, right, decided that they were not going to take unlawful increases in water rates, that they burnt down the Red House. It is because of that that we got representation in the Red House for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, after it was rebuilt, of course. So the very foundation of this parliament, Mr. Vice President, and us being here as citizens of this country, and not at the behest of the Crown, is because of the actions of an NGO, the Ratepayers Association. And so this bill attacks the roots of our struggle in this country. It attacks the root, and I'll explain why. Because if this bill were to be in law in 1970, 1980, in 1950s and 60s, if this bill were to be made law, and if you go to clause 19(1)(c) and clause 20(b), and just for the benefit of persons, of members here, clause 19(1)(c), speaks to clause 19.1 subsection C. The source of its NPO must declare the source of its gross income, which is a separate argument from the argument proffered by Senator Hussain, and I'll explain why soon. And clause 20, subsection B, which states that a person who is found guilty of a criminal offense which carries a penalty of a term of imprisonment of 3 years or more will no longer be able will be disqualified as a controller. 2 organizations come to mind, Mr. Vice President, but 3 types of organizations. One organization is the Tapia House movement. This country would have been robbed of the genius in public dissemination of none other than Lloyd Best. Because Lloyd Best would not have been able to produce the national leaders through the Tapia House movement if this bill were law when the Tapia House movement was being formed. You know why, Mr. Vice President? Yeah. Because under, and I will get to that, it has to do with a word called sedition. But before I reach the Sedition Act, I will give another organization that would have struggled to get people and resources. The National Joint Action Committee, of which I claim vintage, but it is not a selfish statement. It is a statement of fact that many of the persons who filled the ranks of NJAC in those days, before it entered politics, because in those days they didn't believe in conventional politics, was revolution, were graduates from university, persons from the corner, neighborhood persons, workers, intellectuals. They were subject to detention in prisons. And they were subject to detention in prisons based on the law, the Sedition Act. And when you turn to the Sedition Act, which is Act 10 of 1920, amended 1961, 62, 71, and 76, the Act has listed in Section 4 some offenses that would, under Clause 20B of this bill, prevent many a trade unionists, Mr. Vice President, from being involved if the state targets their organization. So,
may I rise on 46.1 respectfully, Mr. Vice President?
I'm on the clause.
Senator Obika, as much as you're tying it to the clauses that you have outlined, just tighten it a little bit, because I understand the point that you're trying to make in relation to movements of the past, and if this law was enacted back then, what would happen. But tighten it up a little bit as you're linking it to the particular clauses of the bill. Continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, and I'm grateful for that little space. So I'll just finish the statement by saying this. If you turn to the Sedition Act, right? And I'll just read just those 2 parts on it, right? Which states basically.
Go to the Sedition Act specifically. I understand the point that you're trying to make. What I'm asking is for you to tighten it up, link it directly to the bill. You've already mentioned the clauses in the bill that you're speaking to, and I understand the argument that you're trying to make. Just shorten it and then move on.
All right, so the argument that I'm making is this. If you are a person subject to a criminal offense that you have a term of imprisonment of 3 years or more, you are disqualified from being a controller in an MPO. Under the Sedition Act, it fetches, if it's on conviction or on indictment, you're subjected to imprisonment for 5 years. It can carry 5 years, up to 5 years. So what I'm saying is basically, if you, Mr. Vice President, wanted to support any of these organizations, because of the requirement under Clause 19 to show the source of income, 19.1c, subsection C, you would not contribute to these organizations because of this Sedition Act and because of this bill. The Sedition Act is already in force, all right? And this bill now makes you be someone who must be declared. And these organizations can be deemed to be enemies of the state. Why is it relevant today? We have a Minister of Communications in this country who is going from pillar to post, accusing citizens of this country of being unpatriotic. Yes. That is akin to calling them seditious. Yes. So what you can find is it can easily move from saying that they're unpatriotic to accusing them of committing sedition.
Mr. Vice President?
You're free.
Senator Obika. the statement that you're making in relation to the Minister of Communications is moving along the lines where it is in breach of 46.6, which is imputation of improper motives. I would ask you to move off that point. You were making a point prior to that, and then you went down that line. Move away from that line and move on to the next point if you've not completed the one before.
Mr. Vice President, the Emancipation Support Committee is listed amongst the NPOs that are alarmed by the Attorney General's NPO bill. Mr. Vice President, the Emancipation Support Committee is listed among those organizations that says that they asked for good faith notification and reasonable opportunity to respond. Reasonable opportunity. Mr. Vice President, the Emancipation Support Committee takes its vintage from these organizations that I mentioned. And I'm saying that we have to be careful when we make law, that we make law with the culture and history of our country. The trade union movement is akin to these very organizations that I've mentioned. And the trade union movement knows no restriction of class, no restriction of ethnicity, no restriction of geographic location. The trade union movement could be targeted directly by this bill. And I'm surprised that the Honorable Minister of Labour could contribute to this bill and not point that out. But I'll leave that there. So I want to move on to an opportunity to share some information with us, a story that was not raised. There's a young man who turned from a life of crime. This is not Wayne Chance, by the way. All right. His name is Ricardo Sozano.
Go. Now, the mere fact that you could reference is not Wayne Chance tells me that it's an argument similar to the argument put forward in relation to that individual. If it is that the argument is that you have an individual, or the story or the example that you're giving, who at one point in their life committed a crime that was punishable beyond 3 years, and therefore they are no longer able to become a controller of one of the MPOs, then you're engaging in tedious repetition at this point. And that is where I'm going to have to stop you. So if that is the example that you're going down, and is that road that you're going down in relation to that offense being more than 3 years, and therefore you cannot be a controller of an MPO, again, that is tedious repetition, and I would ask you to move on from that point. Continue.
I thank you, Mr. Vice President. I see we are at one accord. You have actually made my point for me. I'm enjoying this debate, Mr. Vice President. And I would also say that he will be caught under Clause 24, subsection 2. Now, I want to turn to a group of organizations that really and truly, before I reach there. FATF, Mr. Vice President, in concluding the paper where they spoke of best practices regarding Recommendation 8, they made some very interesting points, all right? And one point they made, point number 3 in the introduction and background.
So Senator Obika, again, at this late stage of the debate, Senator Chote spoke to the best practices from FATF. Other members spoke to it as well. You have to be mindful that if you're going to come into a debate late, you're going to run afoul of the standing order of tedious repetition, because all the arguments for and against are most likely made prior. So you're either coming in with a brand new argument, or you can't make a contribution because you're going to run afoul of that standing order. So I'm going to ask you now, new arguments only.
I want to talk of the group that really and truly, one cannot argue, is integral to our society. And that is the group that surrounds the national instrument, Mr. Vice President. And under this government, the guardians of our national instrument, the steel pan, have been under the most sustained pressure by this government, simply because Pantrin Bego did not want to be party group number X of Balizi House. And I want to ask the Attorney General, I want to ask the Honorable Attorney General, Mr. Vice President, if in crafting this bill, if he spoke to pan elders, if he spoke to hatters, if he went and found Mr. Hoyt of Hoytonians, if they are still around, if he spoke to Fonclair, if he spoke to Southern Marines Steel Band Foundation in Marabella, as he did when he was soliciting their vote in San Fernando. But I would tell you, Mr. Vice President, the office in San Fernando for the Attorney General, the office of the Member of Parliament of San Fernando is vacant, and the people are complaining. But they are not worried because they hear that the former mayor, Saddam Hosein, is coming back.
As much as I've asked you to do something new, you're starting to veer completely off the bill in an attempt to do something new. Okay, let me finish rule. So, Senator Obika, you don't have much time again. I think you have about 6 minutes left. Make your closing arguments.
So, closing argument, Mr. Vice President. The reason why the NPOs exist in our country, and I hope the Attorney General will allow me 2 minutes to make a closing argument. The reason why NPOs exist in this country and are so much in demand for creation now under this PNM government is because that they have abdicated their responsibility. This government claims that Vision 2030 is about placing the environment at the center, but during the flooding of last October, the NGOs had to provide food for persons, had to provide transport for persons. In fact, the Kalpu brothers did a better job than the Minister of National Security. 2 brothers with a boat did better than all the vessels that this government could have commanded. Mr. Vice President, we in the United National Congress, we have heard the cries of the people.
Yes.
We have heard the cries of people in every constituency of this country.
Yes.
And in San Fernando West, we are having a medical clinic this Sunday because they are complaining about the failure of the
Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I've spent 2 days in the Parliament, nearly 48 hours straight. So my patience at times for irrelevance, superfluous, sixth-form style debating arguments is just a little bit thinner than it normally is. And therefore, Mr. Vice President, I'll simply say I'm happy that the UNC finally knows where San Fernando West is. But I didn't know it at any other point in life. Mr. Vice President,
you know where the Comartin Central is.
I'm very grateful to bring conclusion to this debate. We are headed close to that time when a country is going to have to decide what it's going to do about itself, what it's going to do in its situation. The arguments put forward today range from the extremely sensible on the independent bench to the properly political on the opposition bench. I take no difficulty with the opposition being pointedly political. It's largely irrelevant, but they're entitled to be pointedly political, and it's good humor, quite frankly. It may be painful at times to listen to what the opposition has to say, but at the end of the day, they're entitled to have their say, Mr. Vice President. But if we get to the positions of the debate, I'd like to start by saying there are specific provisions in the bill that we do intend to amend. There's specific arguments that have been put onto the floor that must be addressed. And let me start off by dealing with some of the observations made by Learned Senior Counsel, Senator Chote. I'd like to say that I take a very strong objection to Senator Chote's position that there will be no blacklisting of Trinidad and Tobago. Let me put it in a very clear and precise fashion. And I say so from the following point of view. Number one, I served as the chairman of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force for 1 year. Number two, I served as the immediate past chairman of the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force for another year. Number three, I sit on the special grouping called the SG for the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. Number four, I am intimately aware of all of the material of the FATF. And I don't want to pull any punches tonight. Senator Chote asked us to say what we have to say, and I will say no, categorically, and in direct opposition to what Senator Chote has said, that she is wrong, Mr. Vice President. Because, Mr. Vice President, if you think that this government has come here without reading our mutual evaluation report of June 2016, without reading the international standards on combating money laundering and the financing of terrorism and proliferation, the FATF recommendations updated October 2018, without reading the FATF report, Financing of Recruitment for Terrorist Purposes, January 2018, without reading the Evaluations and Compliance Group Special Report, 27th September 2016, without reading Annex 1, examples of measures that NPOs have implemented and which may, depending on circumstances, help to mitigate risk, published 2015, without reading the Best Practices, Combating the Abuse of Non-Profit Organizations, Recommendation 8, June 2015, without reading the FATF report. Could I ask the members of the opposition to calm down?
Continue.
Without reading and consuming the material in the FATF report, Risk of Terrorist Abuse in Non-Profit Organizations, June 2014, if you think for one moment that we didn't digest all of that material, including the interpretation guidelines that come in the book and compendium of positions, I'd like to quite simply say, think again. There is no point in the tenure of my holding this office and this government being in position that we have ever demonstrated a failure to do our homework, Mr. Vice President. Put quite pointedly and quite simply on the record. I say further, Mr. Vice President, Trinidad and Tobago started its fourth round mutual evaluation in 2013, for the record. This assessment was in January 2016. And the FATF guidelines, which took us to a mutual evaluation report, put us as the first country in this Caribbean Financial Action Task Force. And in that cycle, our report being published in June 2016, we were obliged to go into two forms of supervision. The CFATF, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force Enhanced Due Diligence cycle, and the ICRG, the International Cooperation Review Group of the Financial Action Task Force. We were required to give a high-level political commitment, and we were required to participate in an action plan, which is put into writing. It is not capable of being published under the FATF rules. The action plan sets out the manner in which you go about your agenda to achieve technical compliance and operational consistency and efficiency. To hear Senator Saddam Hosein, yes, it was, oh God, when I listened to it. To hear, little boy.
Mr. Vice President,
take off.
Mr. Vice
No.
President, I am a senator.
Absolutely correct.
Members. Honourable members, I will now suspend this House for 15 minutes.